Hey there. I know why you're here. You're looking for a story that will help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Something calming, a little mysterious. Something that carries your mind away. Well, you've come to the right place. Before we begin tonight's journey, do me a little favor. Tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Even just a good night. It really helps more sleepy souls like you find their way here. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin tonight's story. They say silence is safe, but what if the silence is watching? She lived alone. Just her and her dog, a quiet life, a locked door, a routine that never changed, until the knocking started. 3 soft knocks, always just past midnight. No one outside. Nothing on the cameras. And at first, she ignored it, until her dog started growling at nothing. Every night, same time, same door. And then one morning she found claw marks, not on the outside, but on the inside. What was knocking? What was it trying to reach? And why did it know her name? This is the story of what happens when you pretend nothing is there, until it's already inside. Stay with me, because after this, you might never sleep with the door closed again. It started with a sound that felt too quiet to fear. 3 knocks, soft, steady, and deliberate. They came just after midnight, on a Thursday. Not loud, not urgent. The kind of sound that could almost be explained away. She sat on the couch, her dog curled beside her, the flicker of the television painting shadows on the walls. At first, she didn't even flinch. It didn't seem like something to notice, just the wind, she thought, or a neighbor. The building was old. It was a chorus of harmless things. But when the knock came again, same time, same rhythm, same eerie patience, something inside her paused. Not alarm, not yet, just a pause, the kind your body makes when it knows something before your mind does. Her dog lifted his head, blinked at the door, and went back to sleep. That should have comforted her. She told herself it did. She didn't get up to check. Didn't walk to the door. Instead, she turned the volume up on the TV, just enough to cover the memory of the knock, and decided that was the end of it. People hear things at night. That's all this was, a trick of silence. The next day passed like any other. Coffee, emails, a walk through the chilly air with her dog, a grocery list half finished. But beneath it all, the knock lingered, a whisper in the back of her mind. She didn't mention it to anyone. It didn't feel worth the words. A sound in the night didn't deserve space in a conversation. But when evening came and the apartment darkened again, she noticed she was waiting, listening, not for anything specific, just aware. She sat with her dog and her dinner, and the familiar hum of the television. But the moment the clock edged past midnight, she stopped chewing. She didn't even realize she'd done it until the knock came again. 3 taps, slow, measured, so soft they could have been imagined. But she hadn't imagined it. This time, she knew. Her body tensed before her mind caught up. Her dog stirred, looked toward the door again, but stayed silent. That was the part that confused her. He always barked at sounds outside. Squirrels, the mail carrier, footsteps in the hallway. But now, nothing. Just a glance, then stillness. She rose hesitantly and walked to the door. The peephole revealed an empty hall. No movement, no sound. Just that strange stillness buildings have when the world has gone to sleep. She double-locked the door and walked backward down the hall, not turning her back until she was safe in her bedroom, heart thudding a little harder than she wanted to admit. By the fourth night, it had become a pattern. The knock always came at the same time, just past midnight. Never earlier, never later, and it was always the same, 3 knocks, soft and slow. She no longer believed it was the wind, or the pipes, or coincidence. It felt intentional now, like something or someone was trying to get her attention. She told herself not to make it a big deal. She wasn't the type to panic, but she started doing little things without thinking. Leaving a hallway light on, locking the deadbolt even during the day, making sure her phone was always fully charged before bed. The kind of things that looked like habit, but came from a place deeper than habit, came from instinct. Each night, she listened. Each night, her dog lifted his head and looked at the door, but he never barked. That bothered her more than the knock itself. She trusted her dog. He was calm, attuned, but now he was alert, still silent, but no longer relaxed. And that silence felt like a warning in its own right. She started wondering if maybe it wasn't just about what was on the other side of the door. Maybe it was about what the knocking meant, what it was announcing or preparing her for. Then came the 5th night, a night colder than the others. The windows fogged slightly from the difference in temperature. She had just finished brushing her teeth when she heard it. But something about it felt different this time. Not louder, not longer, but heavier, somehow more certain. Like it was no longer asking permission to be heard. It was claiming space. She stepped out of the bathroom and into the hallway, toothbrush still in her hand, water still running behind her. Her dog stood in the living room, rigid, eyes locked on the door. This time, he didn't just look. He didn't just lift his head and settle again. He growled, low and steady. A warning sound, ancient and unmistakable. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't a question anymore. Something was out there, and her dog, the same one who never growled at anything, not even thunder, was growling like he was ready to defend her. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him, watched the door, and listened. But after the knock, nothing followed. No footsteps, no voices, no signs of a prank or a person. Only that heavy silence, thick as a fog, pressing in from every wall. She reached slowly for the light switch and turned on every bulb in the apartment, even the ones she never used. The dog's growl faded, but he didn't sit. He stood like a guard long after the sound had passed. She didn't sleep. Not really. She lay in bed with her eyes open, the lights still on, the dog curled at her side, but not quite asleep either. She scrolled through her phone, rereading old messages, looking at social media as if it might somehow anchor her to normalcy, but nothing online made her feel safer. If anything, it made her feel further away from help. The world outside was vast, unknowable, and all she could hear was the silence in her apartment and the memory of those 3 knocks. She kept thinking about how her dog had reacted, not with panic, not with fear, but with defense, like he'd recognized something he didn't trust that stayed with her. The next morning, she barely touched her coffee. She opened the door slowly, cautiously. The hallway looked the same, boring, quiet, but her dog didn't want to go out right away. He lingered by the door, ears perked, eyes darting like he expected something to be waiting. When they finally stepped into the hall, nothing happened. No sounds, no neighbors, no one, but as she locked the door behind her and walked away, She realized she no longer believed she was imagining things. Something was knocking. Something wanted her attention. And the worst part was, she didn't think it had come from outside. The next few nights were filled with something worse than fear. Anticipation. A sharp, waiting silence that hovered in the corners of every room. The kind that crawled under her skin and made her feel like the walls themselves were listening. Every evening felt slower now, stretched thinner by dread. She'd sit on the couch with her dog by her side, pretending to watch TV but never really absorbing anything. Her eyes would flick to the clock every few minutes as midnight approached. And when the time came, when the numbers blinked over to 12:01, her body would tense before her brain even registered why. She didn't want to look at the door, but she always did. Always, and the knock never failed to come. 3 soft taps, measured, cold, like the sound wasn't just hitting her ears, but reaching into her. Her dog no longer waited to react. Now he stood before the first knock landed. Ears alert, body rigid. He never barked, but the growl had become routine. Low, constant and focused, like he knew whatever was on the other side didn't deserve a warning anymore. It deserved a wall. She started timing everything around that sound. Dinners ended early. Showers were shorter. Phone calls became scarce. And she stopped answering texts after 9 p.m. She didn't want anyone hearing the strain in her voice. Didn't want to explain why she left the lights on all night, or why she started leaving her shoes by the front door, just in case she had to run. Her apartment, once warm and cluttered with comfort, began to feel like a sealed box. A place you stayed in, not lived in. She unplugged the TV one night after the knock, claiming to herself that the static was messing with her sleep. But the truth was simpler. She didn't want the screen reflecting the hallway behind her anymore. Shadows had begun playing tricks in the glass. A flicker, a shape, something that didn't feel like it belonged. Her dog never took his eyes off the door now. He lay with his body between her and the hallway, unmoving, even when she tried to coax him away. It was as if he understood something she didn't, as if he was waiting, not just protecting, waiting for something she wasn't ready to face. She dreamed less and less, and when she did, it was always the same. A hallway, endless, doors on either side, each one closed. The knocking came from every door at once, echoing down the corridor, making it impossible to tell where it started. In the dream she walked slowly, heart racing, trying not to open any of them, but her hands moved on their own, twisting knobs, pushing gently, and behind each one was the same thing. Her own apartment, her own self, sitting in silence, staring at the door. The fear didn't come from what she saw. It came from what she knew in those moments, that she wasn't alone, that something had been with her all along, watching her watch herself. She would wake in a sweat, her dog pawing gently at her arm, nudging her with that quiet urgency only dogs possess. But the real terror came not from the dream, or even the knock, but from how familiar it all began to feel. The routine, the rhythm, the presence, like it wasn't intruding into her life anymore. It was her life. Then came the morning that changed everything. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was just wrong. She had fallen asleep for what felt like only minutes. When she opened her eyes, the clock read 5:17 a.m. Early sunlight bled through the cracks in the curtains, grey and indifferent. Her dog wasn't beside her. That was the first sign. He was always there, always, but now she could hear his nails scratching softly against the floor in the hallway. She sat up, heart already thudding. He was standing at the front door, ears perked, his entire body vibrating with tension. He didn't bark, he didn't growl, he just stared. She stood and crossed the living room slowly, every step heavier than the last. That's when she saw it. On the inside of the door, down near the bottom, thin, deliberate claw marks. Not random scratches, not from her dog. These were deeper, sharper, like something had dragged fingernails across the surface with desperate intent. She dropped to her knees, her fingers tracing the ridges. The wood splintered beneath her touch. It wasn't old damage. It was fresh as her fear. Her breath caught. These marks weren't on the door last night. She had checked. She always checked. She stared at them, unable to blink. They weren't made from someone trying to get in. They were from something trying to get out. She stayed on the floor for a long time, not moving. The air around her felt heavier now, as though acknowledging what she had just learned. Her dog whimpered, gently, and pressed his body against hers. He was shaking. That shook her more than anything else. He had always been calm, even through the knocks, even through the growling. But now he trembled like a child too small to understand why the world had changed. She reached for him, pulled him close, and let her face rest against his fur. For the first time since this all began, she cried, quietly, hopelessly, like something had cracked, like a dam had broken, and nothing could hold back the knowing anymore. She had denied it, rationalized it, ignored it. But there, with her dog trembling and claw marks carved into her door from the inside, denial had finally died. Something had been there, was there, and it wasn't just knocking. It was waiting. She didn't know how long or why. But the thought that haunted her most wasn't that something was trying to hurt her. It was the thought that maybe it already had. Maybe the knocking wasn't a warning. Maybe it was a memory. She began whispering to herself without realizing it. Little phrases, quiet repetitions. It's just in my head. It's not real. Just stress, just dreams. But the words didn't help. They felt like borrowed lies, fragile, rehearsed, like trying to convince a locked door that it didn't exist. Each day felt longer now, stretched by silence and suspicion. She avoided mirrors, turned them face down, or draped them with towels. It wasn't because she saw anything in them. It was because she feared she might. The worst part wasn't what she imagined might appear, but the idea that it might look like her, that somehow what was knocking at the door might not be something entirely separate from her, but something left behind. The hallway light flickered now every night at 12 a.m. Just once, a soft dim, then return, as if the air blinked, and right on cue, 7 seconds later, knock, knock, knock. Her dog didn't just growl anymore. He positioned himself between her and the door, protective, defensive, like he was waiting for something to try and force its way in, or worse, drag something out. One night she thought about opening the door, just to end it, just to see, but she couldn't. Her hand reached the knob and stopped cold, not because she feared what was outside, but because she feared there might be nothing there at all, that this wasn't about a visitor, that this wasn't about someone trying to break in, that this was her own past, her own self, trying to resurface. She began remembering things she'd long buried. A scream in a childhood house, a locked closet, her mother sobbing behind closed doors, nights spent hiding under blankets, pretending silence meant safety. She hadn't thought of any of that in years. But now pieces slipped through the cracks in her memory, like water through a rotted ceiling. And the knocks felt different since then. Not threatening, not pleading, but recognizable, like something old and familiar returning after a long absence. Like a lullaby turned into a warning, she started keeping the hallway light on all night. Not because she needed to see, but because she needed to believe the dark wasn't absolute. Her dog wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink. He just followed her from room to room, never resting for long. She tried coaxing him with treats, chicken, anything, but he'd sniff, then back away, eyes on the door. His behavior made her feel more watched than alone, more studied, and still, no one else in the building said a word. No notes, no complaints, no passing comments in the elevator. It was as if the world outside her apartment didn't notice, or worse, had learned to pretend they didn't. Once, she pressed her ear against the door at noon, just to listen, and she heard something. Not footsteps, not movement, just breathing. Faint, deep, a presence, not frantic, not hostile, just waiting. And that changed everything. It meant the knocking wasn't a performance. It was patience. The patience of something that knew it had time. That whatever battle she was fighting with herself, it would win simply by waiting long enough. The scratches on the door deepened one morning. They weren't fresh, but they'd changed. Extended upward, longer now, as though fingers had kept dragging even after meeting resistance. She ran her nails across the surface beside them. They didn't match. Hers were too clean, too rounded. These were thin, sharp, desperate, as though whatever had made them wasn't clawing to escape, but to hold on, like it had been slipping, like it had tried to stay behind when the night turned back to morning. She placed her palm against the door and closed her eyes. The wood was cold, but not lifeless. It pulsed with something faint, a memory maybe, a grief, or a secret that had never stopped knocking since the day she decided to forget it. That day, she sat in silence for hours, her dog lying across her feet, both of them facing the door, as if it might shift without warning. She thought about recording again, but what was the point? The silence on playback said more than sound ever could. It wasn't about what was heard. It was about what wasn't allowed to be captured. That night, for the first time, she spoke out loud, just one word, a whisper, and after the knock came, after the dog growled, after the air tightened around her chest, there was a pause, a long, dreadful pause. Then, a sound she hadn't heard before. Not a knock, not a footstep, but something like a scrape, like nails dragged slowly across the outside of the door, top to bottom, deliberate, final. Her heart pounded so loudly she almost couldn't hear it. Her dog didn't growl this time. He whimpered and pressed himself against her leg. And for the first time, she felt something shift, not in the room but in herself. This wasn't just haunting. This wasn't just mystery, this was return, and what was returning wasn't entirely foreign. It was a part of her, a chapter she'd sealed away, a memory that refused to be buried. The knocking wasn't a question anymore, it was a statement. You left something behind, and now it wanted to come back in. She no longer needed the clock to tell her when midnight was near. Her body knew it. Her breath would catch, her chest would tighten, and her dog would rise before the first knock, as if he too had learned to feel time differently now. That night, she sat in the middle of the living room, every light on, her phone silent beside her, untouched for hours. She had stopped trying to explain this to herself. It was no longer a question of logic. It had become something deeper, quieter, like mourning something you don't remember losing. She stared at the door from across the room. It looked the same, ordinary wooden plane, but it felt like something else now, like a symbol, a monument, like something sacred and terrible had decided to settle there, and all she could do was watch it breathe through wood and memory. Her dog whimpered softly, and she reached out a hand. He came to her, rested his chin on her knee. She held him close, the only living thing that still felt real. The knocks came, right on time. Soft, even, like a lullaby she once knew the words to, but had forgotten out of self-preservation. The next morning, she didn't sleep. She just stood there facing the door as the light returned slowly through the windows. But this time, the hallway was different. Through the peephole, she noticed something. The door directly across from hers had something taped to it, a small note scribbled in uneven handwriting. Curiosity pulled her forward. She opened her door cautiously, stepping into the hall. Her dog didn't move from the doorway. He growled low but stayed behind. She walked the few steps and leaned in to read. The note said, "Do you hear it too?" Nothing more, no name, no number, just that single question. She looked around. No sounds, no doors opening, just the thudding of her own heart. She returned inside and locked up quickly. Someone else knew, or maybe someone else had heard it once and never recovered. Either way, it was no longer hers alone, and for a brief moment she felt a flicker of relief, but it vanished just as quickly. If someone else had heard it, why hadn't anyone ever spoken about it? Unless they had and weren't believed, or weren't allowed to continue speaking. By now she had lost her appetite, her routine, and her voice. Not literally, but functionally. She had nothing left to say to the outside world. All her energy went into watching, listening, breathing, and remembering. That part was the hardest, because the more she sat in the silence, the more her mind pulled back curtains it had long sewn shut. A box she wasn't supposed to open, full of things she had chosen not to understand as a child. The sound of fists banging behind locked doors, a closet door that rattled at night, a mother's whispered prayers through tears, her own small hands clamped over her ears, pretending the world was safe if she couldn't hear it breaking. The knocking wasn't new. It had just followed her, grown up with her. It had waited for adulthood to quiet her world enough for it to be heard again. The claw marks weren't warnings. They were footprints, proof that fear never really leaves. It just hides until you stop running. And she had finally stopped. It had found her again, not to hurt her, but to finish a story she had buried halfway through. Then came the night when the knock changed. It wasn't 3 soft taps anymore. It was one loud, sharp, commanding. Her dog barked, a sound she hadn't heard from him in days. He stood in front of the door, hackles raised, trembling. She stood too, frozen in place. The air in the apartment shifted, like a vacuum had sucked out the warmth. And for the first time she spoke without thinking. "What do you want?" Her voice sounded strange, not broken, but smaller than she remembered. The silence that followed was heavy. Then another knock, softer this time, slower, and something inside her cracked open. She felt it like grief, but older. Not sadness, not fear, recognition. Her knees buckled, and she sat on the floor. Her dog lay beside her, panting. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there, heart wide open, memory leaking in like rain through shattered glass. This wasn't a haunting. It was a homecoming for something she had once locked away. And maybe it wasn't here to hurt her. Maybe it had come to be seen, to be named, to be heard. At last, Morning came without sleep again, but the hallway held something new. The note across the hall was gone. In its place, nothing. No trace, not even tape residue. She waited by her door all day, listening, but no more knocks came that day. The silence wasn't comforting, it was loaded. She realized then that what had been knocking all this time wasn't a ghost. It wasn't an intruder, it was a part of herself she had ignored for too long. The girl who had hidden in closets, who had counted the seconds between beatings and begged the dark to stay quiet. She had grown up and left that girl behind, closed the door on her, and now the knocking had been her younger self, asking again and again to be let back in. Not to haunt, not to hurt, just to be held, to be remembered. And in that final moment of chapter 1, she whispered to the door, not with fear, but with acceptance, "I hear you now." And behind the wood, behind the scratches, behind the knocks, silence, but not emptiness, a silence that felt like peace. She woke up on the floor, not from sleep, but from exhaustion. Her dog was curled beside her, eyes open, chest rising steadily. Morning sunlight crept across the room, but it didn't feel like morning. It felt like the aftermath of a storm, quiet but not peaceful. Her lips were dry and still. The door was closed, unchanged, but something in the air had shifted. The knocking hadn't come last night. For the first time in weeks, the night passed in silence, but instead of comfort, the stillness unsettled her. As though the knocking had been a rhythm, her soul adapted too, like a heartbeat. You don't notice until it's gone. She stood slowly, joints stiff, and wandered into the kitchen to pour water. Her hand trembled around the glass. She didn't want to admit it, but part of her missed the sound. Not because it was pleasant, but because it made her feel less alone, because it had started to mean something. Like a voice learning how to speak through repetition, and now that it had gone silent, what had changed? Had it moved on? Or worse, was it already inside? By midday, she was pacing. Her dog followed, but kept his distance from the hallway. He still refused to go near the front door. She sat in the armchair near the window and stared down at the street below. Life looked normal. A child dragged a rolling backpack across the sidewalk. An older man smoked a cigarette on the corner. A couple argued half-heartedly near their parked car. The world was spinning as usual, but not hers. Hers was standing still, caught in a pause between what had been knocking and what would come next. She reached for her journal, something she hadn't touched in years. The pages were mostly empty. A few lines from college, scribbled poems, nothing real. But now the words spilled out before she could think. There was a girl I left behind. I closed a door on her. She never stopped knocking, and now she's quieter, but she's still here. Her hand shook as she wrote. She didn't know what it meant exactly, only that she couldn't pretend anymore. This was more than fear. This was history, memory, the return of something too quiet for anyone else to hear. That evening, she made a decision. She pulled the hallway chair closer to the door and sat with her back straight, legs crossed, dog curled beside her. No TV, no phone, just silence, just waiting. She whispered into the air, "I'm here now. You don't have to knock." And with that, she listened. For hours, nothing came. No sounds, no breaths, no whispers, just the sound of her own pulse. But somewhere in the quiet, she felt a presence, not physical, not threatening, but familiar. Like when you walk into a childhood bedroom after years away, and the air still smells like the person you used to be. Her breathing slowed, her thoughts stilled, and she let herself drift, not into sleep, but into memory. Not one memory, but many, fragmented moments rising like mist. Her mother yelling in another room, her younger self hiding behind the laundry basket, a closet that rattled even when empty, a door that never opened. She had spent her life ignoring the weight of those moments, but now they had come to live with her, not to punish, but to be acknowledged, and maybe to heal. She didn't tell anyone. How could she? The world was quick to pathologize pain. It couldn't explain, to name it. Anxiety, trauma, hallucination. But she wasn't broken. She wasn't imagining things. She was remembering. That was different. Remembering meant reconnection. Remembering meant the past was still part of the present. And that was terrifying, because it meant she couldn't run. Not anymore. That weekend, she cleaned the apartment top to bottom, not in panic, but in ritual, as if preparing the space to become something new. She lit a candle in the hallway, not for scent, but for light, for softness, for presence. She left it burning beside the door all night, and still, no knocking came. But every so often, the flame flickered, as if stirred by breath. She whispered once more, before sleep, "If you're still here, I see you now." And in the space after, she felt it, a warmth against her chest, a softness in the air, like a hand pressed gently over her heart. Her dog whimpered once, then curled tighter against her, and for the first time in weeks, she slept deeply, without fear, without sound. Morning came, like an exhale. She stretched, fed her dog, made coffee. But something on the floor caught her eye, a scrap of paper by the front door, folded once, crisp edges. She picked it up slowly, heart thudding. Inside, written in her own handwriting, but from a pen she hadn't used in years, was a single line: "The door was never locked. You just stopped opening it." Her throat tightened. Her dog stood beside her, watching. The note trembled in her hand. She hadn't written it, at least not recently, but she had written it. She remembered now, years ago, after her mother passed, in the middle of a breakdown she never told anyone about. She had scribbled those words on a napkin while sitting in her childhood home, just after unlocking the same closet she had always been afraid of. The closet had been empty, but her fear had been real, and now that memory had made its way here, across years, across lifetimes. Not by accident, but by return. The past had found its voice again, and it no longer needed to knock. It was already home. She kept the note tucked in her journal, like a pressed flower she couldn't let die. That single sentence, "The door was never locked. You just stopped opening it," lingered in her mind like the tail end of a dream she couldn't shake. The past wasn't creeping in anymore. It was walking freely now, speaking softly through memory and time. And still she found herself glancing at the door, not out of fear, but recognition. The knocking hadn't returned, but her dog still growled when dusk fell. Not the frantic bark from the beginning, just a low, guarded sound, like a warning without urgency. She knelt beside him one night and looked him in the eye. "What do you see?" she whispered. He didn't look at her, just stared at the wood, then lay down again, eyes still locked on it. Something was still there, still watching, but different now, like a presence that no longer needed to prove itself. She stood, turned off every light in the house, except for the hallway, and for the first time, she left the door unlocked. Sleep came slowly. She drifted in and out. In dreams, she was a child again, standing outside a door that pulsed with noise. muffled crying, shouts, scraping sounds. In the dream she pressed her ear against it. The surface was cold, like it had never seen light. She wanted to open it. She remembered that much, but her mother's voice echoed behind her. "Don't touch that door. That's not for you." Didn't see in the dream. She turned to ask why, but her mother had no mouth, just eyes full of warning. And when she turned back to the door, the handle was in her hand, turning slowly. Her heart raced. Her dog's growl echoed, even in the dream. Then darkness. She woke with a jolt, breath ragged, fingers clenched. The room was silent, but the candle by the door had gone out. No breeze, no draft, just smoke curling upward from a blackened wick. She sat up, listening. Her dog stood alert. His tail was down. She rose and relit the candle. Her hands trembled. Something had visited, but it had left no trace, except for the flame that no longer stayed lit. By morning, she was different, less afraid, more awake, as if something in her had stretched open, like windows that had long been nailed shut. She called her sister. They hadn't spoken in over a year, not out of malice, just distance, time, silence, silence. "Do you remember the hallway closet?" she asked quietly. There was a long pause on the other end. Silence. Then her sister's voice, soft and thin. "I used to hear knocking. I thought it was just me." A breath left her chest, like a slow collapse. Her hand covered her mouth. "Why didn't you say anything?" she whispered. Her sister exhaled shakily. "Because no one ever believed it when I did." Silence. The line went quiet for a moment. Then her sister added, "I still dream about it sometimes, that closet. The way it used to rattle, like something was inside, waiting." She swallowed. "Me too." The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with years of shared silence, shared fear, shared forgetting. And for the first time, they weren't alone in it anymore. The door hadn't just followed her. It had been with them all along. Later that day, she found herself standing in front of her own closet. It looked harmless, just wood and hinges. But something behind it always made her breath catch. She opened it slowly. Shelves, shoes, boxes, nothing unusual. But she kept staring, heart thudding. She stepped inside, closed the door behind her, let herself sit on the floor in the dark. It was quiet, but not still. It felt like sitting inside a memory. She closed her eyes and whispered, "It's okay now." She didn't expect anything to happen, but her body softened, her breath slowed, her fingers stopped trembling. It wasn't about chasing ghosts. It was about returning to the places she had once abandoned inside herself. The places where fear had lived for too long without light. She stayed there a while, breathing, listening. When she finally stepped back out, her dog was waiting. His head tilted, ears relaxed. He didn't growl, not this time. He followed her back into the room like the air had cleared, like something had been lifted from them both. She smiled softly. Something had changed, not in the house, in her. That night, she dreamed again, but it wasn't a nightmare. It was a memory. She was sure of it. She was 6, sitting on the floor of her mother's bedroom. Her mother was crying in the closet, behind the closed door. She remembered pressing her hand to it, whispering, "Are you okay?" And her mother, voice shaking, had whispered, "Don't ever open this door, sweetheart. Promise me." At the time she had obeyed, without question, without reason. But now, with adult eyes, she understood. The door had never held a monster. It had held her mother's grief, her rage, her exhaustion, All the pain she couldn't name out loud, and somehow, as a child, she had inherited that silence, that sealed pain. It had followed her into every room of her life, and now finally she was learning to name it, to speak where her mother had once wept, behind wood, to open the door without fear of what might be inside. She woke with tears in her eyes, but not from terror, from understanding. And in that understanding, the silence felt different, not like absence, but like peace. She began walking in the mornings, at first just around the block, where cracked sidewalks trace stories of rain and time. Her dog padded beside her, calmer than before. Something in him had softened too. She found herself noticing the little things, the sound of wind caught in tree branches, the rustle of plastic bags dancing across the street, the smell of old leaves and rising heat. For years her world had been small: apartment, work, sleep, repeat. But now, even her silence felt wider, as if grief had expanded her senses, not narrowed them. Some neighbors nodded when she passed. Others stayed behind their hedges. She wondered how many of them heard knocks at night too. How many lived beside memories they never named. One morning she passed an old woman on her porch, hair coiled tightly, eyes sharp despite the wrinkles. As she approached, the woman said, "Your dog watches shadows. That's a gift." She paused, startled. The woman only smiled. Some people closed the door. Others learned to walk through it. Then she turned away, humming. It wasn't advice, it was a knowing. And somehow it made her feel seen. Back home, the hallway felt less like a tunnel and more like a bridge. She no longer avoided the front door. She began to leave it slightly ajar during the day. Just a crack, enough to feel the air change. Her dog still sat guard, but now he didn't growl, just watched, like a sentinel of her progress. One afternoon she sat in front of the door again, holding her journal, pen hovering. She wrote, "I used to think the knocking meant something wanted in, but maybe it was the other way around. Maybe it was part of me trying to get out." The thought curled through her chest like warmth. Maybe the house hadn't been haunted by something evil. Maybe it had just been full of unsaid things, untouched pain, unnamed truths. And now, as they slowly spilled out through candlelight and memory, the house felt different. She noticed how quiet it had become, but not in the heavy way it once was. The quiet now held room, space, breathing, like a body that had finally exhaled after holding its breath for years. Still, the dreams persisted, not terrifying now, but intense. She began waking with remnants of feelings she couldn't fully name. One night, she dreamed of a hallway made of mirrors, each reflecting a version of herself at different ages, 12, 21, 30. In each reflection, she carried something different. A doll, a backpack, a wine bottle. Each version stared back at her, not with judgment, but with exhaustion. And as she walked past them, one by one, they began to disappear, not violently, just dissolved, released. She woke up crying, but the tears felt like rain after drought, cleansing, clarifying. In the mirror above her dresser, she saw herself as she truly was, not haunted, but healing. A woman learning how to face what she'd ignored, learning to forgive herself for surviving, for enduring in silence, and for finally listening. That morning, she poured her coffee slower, sat longer, let the stillness wrap around her like a blanket instead of a threat. Her dog watched her, eyes soft, and for the first time, he wagged his tail without prompt. It was only a few days later that the knocking returned. Just once, a single knock, no rhythm, No repetition, just a single, heavy sound in the middle of the night. She sat up instantly, heart calm, not racing, just alert. Her dog raised his head, ears perked, but he didn't growl, didn't move, just looked at her, as if to ask. Well, she stood, walked to the hallway, lit the candle beside the door, and whispered, "I hear you." No answer, just the sound of her own breath. She reached out and placed her hand on the doorknob. It was warm, not burning, just warm, like something alive had touched it seconds before. She didn't open it, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't need to. The door no longer held the same mystery. She had already opened all the doors inside herself. This one was just wood now, just a symbol. She stepped back, sat on the floor, and let the quiet hold her. Whatever had knocked wasn't there to hurt her. It was there to be acknowledged, and it had been. The knocking stopped and didn't return again, but the claw marks never faded. Each morning, she still saw them on the inside of the door, the surface still rough, the scratches shallow but unmistakable, and she no longer wanted to erase them. They reminded her of the nights she had forgotten how to breathe, of the fear that once ruled her, and the strength that replaced it. Those marks were no longer threats. They were footprints left behind by something that had passed through her and moved on. She thought about repainting, sanding, fixing the wood, but she didn't. Instead, she wrote next to them, with a pen in permanent ink. No one else would see it but her, but that was enough. The past had spoken. She had answered, and though she didn't know what waited beyond this chapter, she knew one thing with certainty. She was no longer afraid of doors, and no longer afraid of the dark behind them. She began leaving the window open at night, just a crack, enough to let the night breathe. The wind sometimes carried whispers, tree branches brushing against the glass, distant sirens moaning through the city's bones. She didn't mind, not anymore. Noise wasn't the enemy, silence had been, and now she understood why it had scared her so deeply. It wasn't the quiet itself, but what the quiet held, the truths that had waited inside it. Now every sound felt like punctuation to a sentence she was still writing. Her dog had taken to sleeping by the door again, but this time it was different. He didn't bristle, he didn't bark. He rested with a kind of sacred trust, like he knew whatever had visited them was finished, respected, released. She wondered if maybe dogs didn't just sense danger, maybe they sensed change. Maybe they were just better at knowing when something had shifted, when a burden had lifted. She envied him for that. The following week, she received a letter, no return address, just her name in ink, delicate and almost childlike. Inside, there was no message, just a single photograph, an old one, blurred at the edges. In it, she stood beside her mother, holding a kite. Her mother's face was half-turned, caught mid-laughter. Her own face was younger, sun-warmed, and smiling. On the back, in faded pencil, were the words, "You were always light, even when you forgot it." She sat down slowly, heart fluttering like that kite in the photo. She had no idea who sent it, but it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like grace, like a thread connecting her to a version of herself she thought was gone. That night, she didn't dream. She slept without interruption. No knocking, no whispers, just rest. Real, whole rest, the kind she hadn't known in years. And when she woke, the world felt slightly tilted toward mercy. She started talking more. At the cafe, she spoke to the barista and learned his name was Miles. At the dog park, she introduced herself to a woman with a golden retriever named Scout. Small steps, yes, but every word she offered someone felt like a stone lifted from her chest. She didn't need to explain the knocking or the nights spent curled on the floor. She didn't need anyone to understand it all. She just needed to be present again. And presence, she learned, was a kind of prayer. A way to honor the fact that she had made it through something, not just lived through it, but faced it, named it, and left it behind without shame. Every conversation, no matter how trivial, was proof of return. The version of her who once kept everything inside, the fear, the hurt, the guilt, had begun to disappear like fog under sunlight. And in her place stood someone braver, not because she wasn't afraid anymore, but because she had stopped pretending she wasn't. And then one evening, she returned home to find the front door slightly open, her heart stilled. Not in panic, but in recognition. She pushed it gently and stepped inside. Nothing was missing, nothing was broken. Just one thing was different. On the hallway wall, a photograph she'd never hung before. It was framed, black and white, a forest path covered in leaves. She had no memory of placing it there. But she didn't feel fear. She felt invitation. She reached out and touched the glass, cool, solid, real. Her dog sat beside her, tail still, gaze steady. She whispered, "I see it." And in saying that, she felt a truth settle in her bones. Maybe some doors open, not to let things in or out, but to let things through. Maybe this house, this life, was not haunted by ghosts, but by grief, longing, memory. And maybe now, finally, those things had found their way home. She stopped waiting for the knock. It wasn't that she didn't care anymore. It was that she didn't fear it. She had spent so many nights measuring her life by what she didn't understand. The sound at the door, the growl in her dog's throat, the weight behind silence. But now she measured her days differently. By the people she spoke to, the meals she made, the mornings she walked without checking behind her. Fear had become like a photograph she no longer looked at. Still there, in the drawer, but no longer necessary. And slowly, in ways so gentle she barely noticed, peace crept in. It didn't announce itself. It simply arrived, settled quietly in the corners of her home, and waited for her to see it. One morning, she found herself humming, no song in particular, just a tune that came from somewhere below thought. Her dog wagged his tail when he heard it, as if he recognized the melody from another life. She laughed and kept going, pouring coffee, opening the window to let in the breeze. When she stepped outside, the sky looked fuller, the street seemed warmer. The world hadn't changed, but she had, and that was enough to change everything. She decided to repaint the door, not to cover the claw marks, but to frame them, to honor them. She chose a deep green, something earthy and rooted. With each stroke, she thought about the nights she had survived, the moments she didn't run, the times she stayed and listened instead of hiding. When it dried, she traced the scars still visible beneath the paint. They hadn't disappeared. They had just been integrated, like veins beneath skin, proof that pain had come and passed. She wrote again more frequently now, not just in her journal, but on scraps of paper left in books, notes to herself stuck on the bathroom mirror. She wrote things like, "Still here, and you made it through. The dark doesn't always mean danger." And she started leaving her front light on at night. A small defiance, a soft signal, a way of saying if anything comes knocking again, I won't hide, I'll answer with light. That night, As she sat by the window sipping tea, her dog stirred. His ears perked, his body alert, but calm. He looked toward the hallway, toward the door, and for a moment she thought it would happen again. The knock, the echo, the return of the thing that once terrified her. But there was nothing, just the hush of evening, the gentle creak of settling walls. And yet she knew something had passed through again, not to haunt, but to witness, to see who she had become. She rose, walked to the door, and opened it. There was no one there, just the street, the air, the night. But she smiled anyway, stepped outside, and whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, not for the fear, not for the sleepless nights, but for the strength it forced her to find, for the way it taught her to open doors instead of waiting behind them, for the way she finally learned to let herself live." And in the weeks that followed, she found herself inviting people over, small gatherings, a neighbor who had once only nodded in passing, a co-worker who always ate lunch alone. They brought stories, laughter, different kinds of silence, and she welcomed it all. Her living room, once dim and unused, now flickered with candlelight and voices. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt lived in, alive. Sometimes after everyone left, she would sit alone on the couch, holding her mug, and just listening to the creaks. The distant city hummed, the way stillness sounded when it wasn't empty. Her dog at her feet, her heart not thundering but steady. Steady was enough. One evening, during a light rain, she placed a small wind chime outside the door. It was made of wood and glass and soft brass. It didn't ring much, only when the wind moved just right. But when it did, the sound filled her hallway like a soft memory, a reminder that even the air could sing, that nothing needed to knock anymore. The door no longer needed to be tested. She had made peace with it, and in that peace, she found herself sleeping more deeply, dreaming differently, the kind of dreams that didn't haunt, but healed. In one of them, she stood inside her apartment and saw light coming from the closet. Not a threatening glow, but warm, like sunlight filtered through curtains. She walked toward it, opened the door, and instead of shelves or coats, there was a path, a forest, the same one from the photograph that had appeared weeks ago. She stepped into it barefoot, unafraid, birds overhead, a stream nearby, and beside her walked her dog, tongue out, tail wagging, no growling, no fear, just movement, and in the distance she heard laughter, her own voice, younger, echoing through the trees. When she woke, her pillow was damp from tears. She hadn't known she cried, but she didn't feel grief. She felt light. That morning, she took a walk before sunrise. The streets were quiet, painted with the soft gold of early day. She watched shopkeepers open shutters, delivery drivers move like shadows, and birds reclaim telephone wires. And as she passed the corner where she used to turn around, where she once feared what waited at home, she kept walking, past it, forward, no hesitation. She didn't need to look back anymore. It began with a cold breeze in summer. She noticed it first one evening. As she closed the window, a chill slipped across her skin, soft but sharp, like fingers brushing her back. She paused, touched her arm. Goosebumps. The air outside was warm. She'd checked the forecast, yet the breeze was unmistakable. The dog, who had been dozing at her feet, lifted his head slowly. Not alarmed, not growling, just watchful. Like he too felt something shift. She chalked it up to imagination. Maybe she was still in tune with the old fear. some muscle memory she hadn't fully shaken. Even peace, it seemed, had its echo, but the chill returned the next night. Not outside this time, inside. It passed through the hallway, rustled the edge of a picture frame, made the lights flicker, just once. Her dog stood again, tail stiff, ears forward. No sound, no growl, just a tension she recognized. She set her mug down and walked to the hallway, rubbing her arms. Old building, she whispered. Drafts, just drafts. She smiled at herself, spoke aloud just to hear a human voice fill the space. But as she turned back toward the living room, her dog didn't follow. He stood at the edge of the hallway, eyes fixed on the bedroom door. She didn't sleep much that night. She laid still in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and sighs of the apartment. The wind chime outside the front door rang once, gently, without wind. She closed her eyes and breathed. It's nothing, she said to herself. Just a memory. Just my mind, playing tricks. But the silence didn't comfort her like it used to. It felt full again, the kind of full that made you feel watched. The next morning, the mirror in the bathroom was fogged. Not from a shower. She hadn't taken one yet. She stood staring at it, unsure whether to wipe it clean or leave it untouched. Her fingers hovered just above the glass, then stopped. A shape had started to emerge in the condensation. A line, then two more, curved, like the edge of a symbol or a letter unfinished. She stepped back, pulse rising. It disappeared as quickly as it came, gone before she could decide what it looked like. She didn't mention it to anyone, not yet. The next few days passed, in a strange calm. No wind, no sounds. The apartment was still. She cleaned, worked from home, watered her plants, played with the dog, took walks. But the stillness didn't feel restful. It felt staged, like a theater set waiting for something to begin. Even the dog moved differently, quieter, more alert. He started sleeping closer to her, his head always angled toward the hallway, like a soldier posted at his station. One evening, she lit a candle. She didn't usually use them in summer, but something about the flicker brought comfort, something ancient. It made the shadows less sharp. The flame danced gently in the center of the room. While she read, her dog curled up beside her. But as she turned a page, the flame flickered wildly and went out. No draft, no window open, just darkness. She sat frozen, the book resting on her lap. She reached for her phone and turned on the flashlight. The room looked the same. No movement, no shape in the corner. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had passed through again. And this time, it hadn't left. The dog barked, once, loud and sudden, then stopped. His body was low, eyes fixed on the bedroom again. She stood, slowly, and walked toward the door. There was nothing unusual, nothing visible, just a closed door, and her reflection in the glass of the hallway frame. She hesitated, fingers on the doorknob, then opened it. Everything looked fine, until she saw the closet. It was open again. She was sure, absolutely sure. She had closed it that morning. She always did, now. It had become habit, a kind of symbolic closure. But tonight, it was open an inch. Not wide, not dramatic, just enough to be a whisper. An invitation, or a warning. She approached it carefully, aware of every breath, every step. Her dog followed, silent, his fur slightly raised. She placed her hand on the closet door and pushed it open fully. Nothing, just coats, boxes, the usual clutter. She scanned it all twice. Then again, nothing had moved. Nothing was out of place. Except one of the boxes was missing its lid. She hadn't touched those boxes in months. She crouched, lifted the top one, and looked inside. Old photographs, a journal, a small broken music box from her childhood, all untouched. But underneath them, something new, a folded piece of paper. She picked it up. It was yellowed, as if aged, but the folds were fresh. Her name was written on the outside, in a hand she didn't recognize. Not the handwriting of a friend or relative. It was angular, almost elegant, but strange. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single sentence. You looked once. Look again. She dropped it. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she stood quickly, backing away from the closet. Her dog barked again, now growling, low and guttural. She grabbed the paper, slammed the closet shut, and locked her bedroom door behind her. Sleep did not come. She lay there in the dark, the paper on the nightstand, the sentence repeated in her head like a riddle. Looked once, look again. What had she missed? What hadn't she seen? Her thoughts spiraled. Her breathing grew shallow. The dog didn't sleep either. He sat by the door all night, growling softly at nothing. By morning, she felt brittle, like something inside her had cracked and hadn't yet broken. She stood in front of the mirror again and looked into her own tired eyes. She didn't see fear there, just exhaustion, but also something else. Determination. She took the note, held it over the sink, and lit it. The flame consumed it quickly, curling the edges inward like it was hungry. She watched until it was ash. Then she washed the remains down the drain and opened the window. She wasn't going to let it take her back. Whatever it was, whoever it wasn't in control anymore. Not of her thoughts, not of her nights, not of the home she had rebuilt from fear. But that night, the knocking returned. Not like before. It was slower, softer, 3 knocks, then silence. Her dog didn't bark this time. He stood, tense, but didn't make a sound. She stood too, staring at the door from across the room. She didn't move, didn't speak, just listened. 1 minute, 2, 3, no other sound followed. Then came the whisper, not outside, inside, from the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat. It was low, almost too soft to hear, but it said her name, just once. She didn't scream, she didn't run. She walked to the hallway and stood there, staring at the closed bedroom door. Then with shaking hands, she reached for the doorknob and opened it. The room was empty, so was the closet. But on the bed, on her pillow, was a single object. Her old photograph, the one that had disappeared, the one with the forest. But this time, something was different. In the photo, at the very edge of the trees, was a small dark figure, watching her. She stared at the photograph for nearly an hour. The tiny dark figure standing at the edge of the forest wasn't there before. She was sure of it. It hadn't been part of the original image. The lighting was different, the shape too defined. It wasn't just a blur or shadow. It had a form, a stance, not quite human, but close enough to suggest that it watched, that it had always watched. Her throat dried as her eyes scanned the picture again and again, searching for context, a clue, something she might have missed. But there was nothing else in the image, just the same forest from her dreams, the same winding path, and that figure, motionless, distant, and terrifyingly aware. She placed the photo down gently, as though afraid to wake something sleeping inside it. She didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute. She sat at the edge of her bed, lights on, door closed, her dog beside her, but restless. He wouldn't settle. His eyes flicked toward the hallway every few minutes, his ears twitching with every creak in the walls. It reminded her of how things were in the beginning, when the knocking was still new, when fear had its own heartbeat. She had come so far since then. She had found silence, warmth, even laughter. But now it felt like she had been walking in a circle, and all her progress had only led her back here to the door, to the photo, to the whisper. Only this time, something was different. The presence didn't feel like it was outside anymore. It had moved in, quiet and polite, like it had been waiting for her to grow strong enough to see it for what it truly was. The following morning, she took the photograph to the kitchen and left it on the table. She made herself tea, hands trembling as she poured. The cup clinked gently against the saucer, betraying her unease. She didn't drink it. She just sat there, across from the image, as if in conversation with it. "What do you want?" she whispered. Her voice felt strange in the silence, foreign. Why now? No answer came, of course. But in her gut, she felt something stir, an intuition, a thread of understanding, unraveling slowly. This wasn't random. The figure wasn't trying to frighten her anymore. It was inviting her, drawing her back to something. The whisper hadn't been a threat. It had been a call, familiar, even intimate, like an echo of someone she once knew and had long forgotten. That day, she did something she hadn't done in years. She returned to her childhood home. It wasn't far, just 2 towns over, but it felt like a lifetime away. The road was quiet as she drove, the trees lining the highway, standing tall like silent witnesses. She hadn't seen the house since her parents sold it, after her grandmother passed. But she remembered every inch of it, the way the porch creaked, the way the door never quite shut unless you lifted it just right. The backyard, where she used to hide under the lilac bushes, and the forest, that same forest from the photograph. It was behind the house, dense and dark, always forbidden. She was never allowed to go in. Her grandmother used to say, "The woods remember what we forget." Back then, it sounded like folklore. Now it sounded like a warning. She parked across the street, hands gripping the steering wheel. The house looked older than she remembered. Faded paint, broken shutters, the lawn wild with weeds. It was empty now, and had been for years. She got out, her dog following hesitantly. Something in him recognized the place. He stayed close, unusually close, as she walked to the backyard. The grass crunched beneath her feet. Her breath came slower. The edge of the forest stood just beyond the fence, unchanged, untouched, and yet it hummed, not audibly, but with a kind of energy that made her skin prickle. She opened the gate and stepped through. The dog stopped. He whined, low and uncertain, but didn't follow. She turned to him, knelt down, stroked his head. "It's okay," she whispered. "I have to see." Then she stood and walked toward the trees. The moment she crossed the tree line, the air changed. It was cooler, but not unwelcoming. The path was there, the one from the photo, winding and narrow, covered in moss and fallen leaves. She walked slowly, every step echoing with memories she couldn't quite place. Flashes of her grandmother's voice, laughter, a lullaby she hadn't heard since she was 5. As she moved deeper into the woods, the shadows grew longer, though it wasn't late. Time felt slippery. Her heart beat steady but fast, like it knew something her mind was still catching up to. After 10 minutes of walking, she stopped. Ahead of her stood a small clearing, and in the center of it, a tree with bark darker than the others, gnarled and thick, with something carved into it. She approached. The carving was old, worn by weather, but still legible. It was her name. Beneath it, another name, a name she didn't recognize, and beneath that, a symbol, the same curved line she had seen in the bathroom mirror. She stepped back, throat tight. What was this? A prank? An old game she had forgotten. But no, there was too much intention, too much precision. Someone had placed this here for her to find. Someone had known she would return. A breeze passed through the clearing, rustling the leaves above. She turned, ready to leave, when something caught her eye near the roots of the tree. A box, old wooden, nearly swallowed by the earth. She dug it out with trembling fingers, dirt under her nails. It was light, locked with a rusted clasp. She didn't open it then. She didn't even try. She just held it, close to her chest, and walked back the way she came. The forest didn't resist her exit, but it didn't welcome her back, either. It simply watched. And as she crossed the threshold back into the yard, her dog barked once and ran to her. That night, back in her apartment, she opened the box. Inside was a letter, written in that same angular handwriting, and a pendant, small, round, with the same symbol etched into its surface. She unfolded the letter slowly. It read, "You are not alone in the dark. You never were. The knocking wasn't warning. It was memory. Open the door. Let it in." She read the words again and again, trying to make sense of them. The knocking wasn't warning. It was memory. She touched the pendant. It was cold, heavier than it looked. In the silence of her apartment, she heard it again. 3 soft knocks. And this time, she stood up and walked to the door. She stood in front of the door, hand hovering inches from the knob. The knocks had come again 3, slow and deliberate. But this time, something in her was different. She wasn't trembling. Her breathing was steady. The fear, once all-consuming, had dulled into something else. Not courage, exactly, but understanding. The pendant around her neck felt heavy, like it pulsed faintly with a rhythm not her own. The words from the letter repeated in her mind. The knocking wasn't warning. It was memory. She didn't know what she expected to find on the other side of the door. An intruder? A ghost? A fragment of her past that refused to stay buried. But something in her knew it was time to open it. She curled her fingers around the knob and turned. No one was there, just the hallway. Dim, still, silent, but the air felt charged, like something had just left, or was still present, but unseen. She stepped outside, her dog pressing close behind her, protective and anxious. She scanned the hallway. No neighbors, no sounds. The wind chime she'd hung days ago swayed gently, though the air around it was still. She looked down. No footprints, no signs of tampering. Yet she knew, deep in her gut, something had changed. The knocks had drawn her here, not to frighten, but to awaken. She closed the door slowly and turned back toward the apartment, the pendant warm now against her skin. Her dog hadn't barked. He only looked at her, eyes deep and knowing, as if he understood something she hadn't yet pieced together. That night, she couldn't sleep again, but it wasn't fear keeping her awake. It was anticipation. She lit another candle and placed the box beside it, on the table. The light flickered softly, casting long shadows on the wall. She unfolded the letter again, examining each stroke of the strange handwriting. A memory began to flicker in the corner of her mind, of her grandmother, whispering to her when she was young, telling her stories of old ways and family secrets buried beneath roots. At the time, it had seemed like make-believe, but now she wasn't so sure. She'd always felt the pull of something she couldn't name. The dreams, the sensations, the knocking. What if it wasn't all in her mind? What if the door wasn't just literal, but spiritual? She looked at the photograph again, now framed in the box. The dark figure still stood at the edge of the woods, waiting. The more she stared, the more she realized it wasn't threatening. It was familiar. Not in the way she recognized it as a person, but in the way you recognize your own reflection after a long time away. Could it be someone she once knew? A guardian, an echo of herself? Her grandmother had once told her, some things don't knock to come in. They knock to remind you that you're already inside. She hadn't understood it then, but now those words seemed to frame everything. The knocking wasn't trying to enter. It was trying to lead her deeper, into memory, into origin, into something she had forgotten how to see. The days that followed were strangely calm. No more knocking, no strange chills, no flickering lights or claw marks. The silence had returned, but not empty. It felt sacred now. She spent her mornings walking through the city like she'd never really seen it before. Her evenings were quieter, her dreams vivid, but not terrifying. She dreamt of her childhood again, of her grandmother's hands, of the lilac bush in bloom. But always in the background, the forest waited, that path, winding and endless. She began sketching it during the day, recreating it from memory. The tree with her name, the pendant symbol, the box. Her walls began to fill with charcoal renderings of the dream space, like pieces of herself were coming back into form. Her dog watched her closely, never far from her side. One night, she dreamed she was back in the forest. Only this time, it wasn't from the past. It was now. She walked the same path, the pendant glowing softly around her neck. The woods weren't silent anymore. They hummed with life. As she reached the clearing, the tree waited, carved and dark, but not ominous. It felt like home. She touched her name on the bark, and suddenly the figure from the photograph appeared, standing across the clearing. It did not move. It did not speak. But this time, she felt no fear. She stepped closer, and as she did, she saw its face for the first time. It was her, not as she was now, but as she could have become. Wild, strong, eyes filled with ancient knowledge and deep sorrow. Her hair longer, streaked with ash and time. Her body cloaked in something made of wind and woven light. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was a version of her that had never left the forest. A version that had accepted the knock, walked through the memory, and stayed. They stared at each other for what felt like hours. Then her other self lifted a hand, and in her palm was a key. Small, gold, old. She stepped forward, placed it in the waking woman's hand, and whispered, "Unlock what you buried." She woke up gasping, the pendant burning hot, and in her fist, clenched tight from sleep, was the key. She stared at the key in her palm for a long time. It was real, heavy, cold. The design was unlike anything modern. A narrow shaft with ornate, swirling etchings and a small crescent-shaped bow. It had the same symbol engraved into its head, the curved lines from the pendant and the mirror, the same symbol carved beneath her name on the tree. It wasn't a coincidence. None of it was. She sat on the edge of the bed, key in one hand, pendant in the other, and realized the truth that had been circling her for weeks. The knocks had always been a part of her, a call from within, a summons she had ignored for most of her life. This wasn't about haunting. It was about remembrance, about unlocking something that had long been sealed shut. She didn't know what the key opened, not yet, but deep down she understood it wouldn't be something obvious, not a drawer or a chest. It would be something symbolic, something personal, something sacred, and maybe something painful. Memories, perhaps. Feelings she had locked away when she was too young to process them. Her grandmother's death, the silence that followed, the dreams, the old stories of doors between worlds and the family secret no one would ever explain. She looked around the apartment. Nothing here had a lock that matched. Nothing here held what the key was meant to open. But she wasn't looking in the right place. The answer wasn't here. It was back at the house. The old one. The one where it all began. She packed a bag the next morning and left without a plan. Her dog jumped into the car beside her like he knew the road ahead. She didn't play music. She didn't speak. The trees blurred past the windows, tall and unmoving, as if escorting her back. The air grew cooler the closer they got. She parked in front of the house and stared for a long moment before getting out. The structure still stood, tired and sagging. Time had not been kind, but it was still there. And as she stepped onto the porch, the floorboards groaned beneath her feet, like a greeting from an old friend. She pulled out the key and held it against the lock on the front door. It didn't fit. Of course it didn't. This key wasn't for doors made by human hands. She walked around the side of the house, past the overgrown bushes and broken fence, and back toward the forest. Her dog followed silently, tail low, ears alert. The wind was gentle but persistent, rustling through the trees in a low whisper. She stepped past the fence and into the woods, following the same path she had before. But this time she wasn't afraid. She walked with purpose, with memory guiding her steps. The pendant around her neck grew warmer with each footfall. The forest welcomed her, or rather it acknowledged her. After all this time she had finally returned. At the clearing she found the tree again, the one with her name, and now beneath the roots, where she had found the box, there was something new. A small door. It hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had, but she hadn't been ready to see it. It was carved into the earth itself, framed in stone and bark, only visible now that she was carrying the key. No handle, just a keyhole, nestled in the center of the wood. She knelt, heart pounding, and slid the key in. It turned smoothly, silently, like it had been waiting. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow tunnel descending into darkness. Her dog whined softly but didn't retreat. She lit her flashlight, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The tunnel was narrow and earthen, the walls lined with roots and stones, cool air brushing against her skin. It spiraled downward slowly, and she descended step by step, heart steady. She didn't know how long she walked. Minutes, hours, time felt suspended. Eventually the tunnel opened into a chamber, round, ancient, and in its center, a mirror, tall, ornate, untouched by dust. Surrounding it were objects, a child's drawing, a stuffed animal, a broken locket, a small shoe. All of them things she hadn't seen since childhood, forgotten, buried, lost. She approached the mirror. At first her reflection stared back, older, wiser, exhausted but alive. Then the image shifted, the forest, the knocking, her younger self, crying behind a locked door. Her grandmother, humming softly on the other side. And then the night her grandmother died. The way no one had explained anything. The way the knocking started soon after. Not on the door outside, but in her heart. A kind of grief she was too young to name. A voice that had tried, over and over, to be heard. She touched the glass, and it rippled like water. And then she remembered the secret. The old stories were never just stories. Her grandmother had told her once, the women in this family hear the knock when it's time to return. She hadn't understood it then, but now she did. The knocking was a call to come back to herself, to the truth, to the gifts passed down through generations. The door was not outside, it was within, and she had finally opened it. She sat in the chamber for what felt like a lifetime. Not trapped, but safe. The mirror no longer reflected confusion. It showed her as she truly was. Not haunted, not broken, but whole. Remembered, her grandmother appeared one last time, just behind the glass. Not a ghost, not a spirit, but a memory made real. She didn't speak. She only smiled, placed a hand on the mirror's surface, and nodded. A gesture of pride, of welcome, of love. The kind that never dies, only changes shape. She rose, her body aching, but lighter. The chamber pulsed gently with warmth. The key she'd used to open the hidden door now glowed faintly in her palm, then dissolved into dust. She wasn't meant to lock anything away again. This was a door that opened only once, when the soul was ready, and she was. The walk back through the tunnel felt shorter. Her dog waited at the edge, tail wagging slightly, as if sensing the shift in her. She emerged from the woods with dirt on her hands and peace in her chest. The house behind her faded into the distance, no longer looming, just part of the past. She didn't need to return again. She had brought everything she needed out with her. That night, she didn't hear any knocking. There was no need. She had opened the door and let herself in. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. For the first time in weeks, she slept without dreams. No knocking, no whispers, no flickers of something watching from the shadows. Just silence, deep and whole. When she awoke, the world felt different. Not new, exactly, but real, more vivid. The light that filtered through her windows touched her face like the memory of her grandmother's hand. The warmth stayed. Her dog stretched beside her, peaceful and calm. For so long, she had waited for something to stop. The noise, the fear, the unknown. But now it felt like she was beginning something, not ending it. The knocks had not been a threat. They had been a signal, a call, a reminder of what was buried and who she truly was. As she moved through her apartment that morning, she noticed things she had never truly seen. The books on her shelf, the pictures she'd stopped looking at, the dust that had settled not just on her belongings, but on her life. There were photos of her as a child, standing in the forest with her grandmother. She hadn't remembered them clearly before, but now every detail was sharp. Her grandmother's eyes, the wild flowers clutched in her tiny hands, the carved tree in the distance. How had she lived so long forgetting the parts of her that mattered most? The air in the room shifted slightly, not chilling, not eerie, just alive. The pendant around her neck pulsed faintly again, a heartbeat she was no longer afraid to feel. The dog, too, had changed. He no longer growled at shadows. He no longer stood between her and the door at night. Instead, he curled at her feet when she lit the candle in the evenings, as though he finally trusted the quiet too. The claw marks on the inside of the front door had faded. She hadn't painted over them. They had simply disappeared. She stood in front of the door more than once, hand resting on the handle. No knocking came, but still she felt it. A soft rhythm in her chest, a memory in her blood, as if some part of the forest still echoed inside her, guiding her forward. It wasn't over. The fear might have passed, but the story wasn't finished. A week passed, then another. She began journaling more, writing down the dreams, the memories, the fragments that returned in waves. She no longer tried to piece it all together. Logically, it didn't need to be solved like a puzzle. It needed to be honored. Her grandmother had said, "When the knocking stops, you begin again." At the time, it had sounded like folklore, but now it was truth. She started remembering other things too. The herbs her grandmother used to keep near the window, the way she spoke to the moon, the rituals she performed on cold nights, gentle ones, filled with light and reverence. She had called them reminders, not spells, just ways of remembering who we are, she used to say. And so she began doing the same, not because she was told to, but because it felt like remembering a language she'd once been fluent in. She gathered sage and rosemary, lavender and thyme. She placed them around the apartment, not out of superstition, but out of recognition. These were symbols, yes, but also tools, anchors, connections to the past, to herself. She lit the candle every night at dusk and spoke softly, not to anyone in particular, but to the space. A simple acknowledgement. I see you. I hear you. I'm still here. Her dog would watch her from his usual spot, tail curled neatly, ears relaxed. Even the apartment seemed to breathe easier. Then one evening, something shifted again. It was subtle, but undeniable. The candle flickered 3 times, and then the flame went still. She paused, waited, not with fear, but with curiosity. And then she heard it. Not a knock, not exactly, but a click. Soft, metal against metal, from the hallway. She opened the door without hesitation. The hallway was empty, except for a package, wrapped in old brown paper, tied with a red string. She looked down at it, heartbeat steady, fingers warm around the doorknob. No name, no return address, just the symbol again, drawn in black ink on the top flap. She bent down, picked it up, and carried it inside. Her dog sniffed it once, then backed away, not out of fear, but deference, as if he too understood. This wasn't a threat. It was another message, another memory coming home. Inside the package, nestled in a soft cloth, was a journal, old, weathered, handwritten. The cover bore the initials she hadn't seen in years, her grandmother's. She sat with the journal in her lap for a long time before opening it. The leather cover was cracked with age, its edges soft from being held many times. The initials embossed into the corner, subtle, almost faded, were unmistakably her grandmother's. She traced them with her fingertips, feeling a strange ache behind her ribs, like grief blooming in reverse. This wasn't pain, not really. It was longing, memory, connection, something deeper than nostalgia. Her grandmother had been gone for years, and yet somehow she was closer now than she'd ever been in life. The journal smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, her grandmother's scent. She inhaled deeply before lifting the cover. The first page was dated 27 years ago. Her name was written there in cursive. Her birth name, not as a heading but as a beginning. For her, when she's ready, the words hit her like a wave. Her throat tightened. She turned the page, heart heavy but steady, and began to read. The entries were soft-spoken and vivid. Some were reflections, quiet moments in nature, notes on the seasons, the moon, the small changes in energy that most people missed. Others were more direct, descriptions of dreams, visions, stories passed down through generations. Her grandmother had written of the knocking too, but never in fear. She described it as a threshold, a calling, a signal that the veil between the known and the forgotten had thinned. There were entries about her as a child, little moments her grandmother had captured with delicate language, how she used to collect rocks and hide them under her pillow, how she spoke to trees in a language only she understood, how she once stood completely still during a storm and smiled as if listening to something beyond the thunder. And then the entries darkened, not in tone but in meaning. Her grandmother had known her time was short. The knocking had returned to her too, not from the outside, but from within. I feel it in my bones now, she had written, like an old rhythm finding its way home. And in her final pages, she had written this: when she hears it, she must not run. The door she fears is not meant to trap her, it is meant to lead her back. If I cannot guide her in body, let these pages guide her in spirit. The gift is not the knocking. The gift is what she becomes when she answers it. She wept then, quietly, as her dog laid his head on her foot. The candle burned silently nearby, casting gentle shadows on the walls. The days that followed were slow and intentional. She carried the journal with her like a sacred thing, reading a few entries at a time, letting them sink in. She began to follow the small rituals her grandmother had written. Nothing dramatic or ceremonial, just simple acts of remembering. Lighting a candle with intention, placing salt on the windowsills, speaking to the moon at midnight, pouring water onto the soil before the sun rose. These acts felt less like magic and more like alignment, like tuning a quiet instrument inside her that had long been ignored. Each time she performed one of these rituals, something shifted, not outside, but within. Her mind grew quieter, her heart beat in rhythm with something ancient, and with every passing day, the apartment seemed more alive, not haunted, but aware, as though the space around her had been waiting for her to truly show up. One evening, as she lit the candle and placed her hand on the journal, a breeze passed through the closed window. The flame didn't flicker, it grew still, tall and silent. She felt a presence behind her, not a figure, not a form, just warmth. She turned, but nothing was there, and yet something had arrived. It was around that time that the dreams returned, but differently. They no longer left her gasping or afraid. Instead, they felt like conversations, gentle ones. She saw her grandmother often, always standing near a tree, always humming that same low tune. No words were exchanged, but every dream ended the same way, her grandmother reaching out with an open palm. She'd awaken before she could take it. Night after night, the same gesture, the same ache, and she began to understand the journey wasn't over. The journal was not the final message. It was only the next door. One morning, she felt pulled back toward the forest. Not because something called her, but because something had changed inside her. The woods were no longer a place of mystery. They were a place of memory. She walked the same path again, this time with no fear and no questions. Her dog followed closely. Birds overhead chirped with a rhythm that felt like recognition. She returned to the clearing and stood in front of the tree, the one with her name carved beneath the roots. The small door there had vanished. In its place was something new, a circle of stones, and at its center, a wooden box, not buried, placed like a gift. She knelt and opened the box. Inside was another mirror, this one smaller, framed in wood that matched the trees around her. Beneath it lay a folded cloth, embroidered with her grandmother's symbol, and inside that cloth something shimmered faintly, a ring, gold, simple, etched with the same crescent-shaped lines from the key, the journal, the pendant. She held it in her palm and felt a warmth rise through her chest. This was not jewelry, it was a seal, a reminder, a birthright. She placed it on her finger, and for a moment, the forest around her stilled completely. The wind stopped, the birds paused, the leaves froze mid-sway, and then all at once, the world exhaled. She knew what she had to do next. Return, not to the past, but to herself. She stood in the clearing, no longer a visitor, but part of it. The woods had welcomed her, the knocking had changed her, and now she was ready to take what had always been hers. Not magic, not power, not secrets, but clarity. She had answered the knocking, not by unlocking a door, but by unlocking her voice. Her grandmother had left her a trail, not to follow but to remember, and now the story she'd inherited was hers to tell. The night after she found the wooden box, she dreamed again, but this time it was different. She wasn't in the forest. She was in her childhood home, sitting in her grandmother's chair by the window. The room was bathed in soft golden light, and outside it was raining, gentle, steady, like the rhythm of a lullaby. Her grandmother sat across from her, knitting, just like she used to. But this time, she looked up and smiled, her eyes filled with something eternal. No fear, no warning, only peace. Did you find it? Her grandmother asked. She nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the ring still on her finger, even in the dream. Her grandmother set the knitting aside and leaned forward. Then, you're ready. For what? Her grandmother didn't answer. Instead, she reached out the same way she had in every dream before. Palm open, quiet, waiting. This time, she didn't hesitate. She took her grandmother's hand, and the moment she did, everything changed. She felt the dream collapse around her like a ripple in a still pond. But instead of waking, she fell deeper, deeper than dreams, deeper than memory. She was no longer in a room, or even in her body. She was floating in a space that pulsed with warmth and light. And somewhere, from the center of that light, a voice, not her grandmother's, not hers, but something older, spoke. You are the end of the forgetting. She gasped as she woke, heart pounding, tears streaming down her face. Her dog stood beside the bed, staring at her with calm, alert eyes. The candle on the windowsill had gone out on its own, and the ring on her finger, once cool, was now warm against her skin. The following day was strange in ways she couldn't explain. People looked at her differently. Some smiled at her without knowing why. Others stared for a moment too long before looking away. It was as if the air around her had shifted, and the world had noticed. But it wasn't just the outside that had changed. Inside, she felt grounded in a way she never had before. Her fears no longer sat at the edge of her mind. Her doubts had fallen silent. She no longer needed to ask what the knocking had meant, because now she understood it had never come from something outside, trying to get in. It had come from the inside, begging to be let out. The knocking wasn't from a ghost or a spirit. or an intruder. It was from her, the part of her that had been silenced, buried, ignored, the part that remembered everything, all the nights spent wondering, all the dreams half remembered, all the whispers in the dark. They weren't warnings, they were invitations. Her grandmother had known, her ancestors had known, and now she knew too. The only way forward was through remembrance, not of facts or stories, but of who she was before the world told her to forget. She began to change her home, piece by piece, not because it was haunted, but because it deserved to be honored. She created a small altar by the window with the journal, the pendant, the mirror, and the ring box. She added herbs and photographs, scraps of fabric, small stones from the forest. These were not decorations, they were declarations. Every piece held a memory, a vibration, a name, and each night she sat before it, sometimes in silence, sometimes in prayer, and sometimes simply to say, "I'm still here." The dog had taken to sleeping near the altar, not protectively, but peacefully. He no longer flinched at creaks in the floor, or stared into corners. He seemed to understand as she did, that whatever had been knocking wasn't something to fear. It was something to welcome. She started to write again, not just in her journal, but for others. Blog posts, essays, letters to people she'd once lost touch with. She didn't explain the entire story. How could she? It wasn't something that could be summarized. But she wove the feeling of it into her words. The knowing, the stillness, the remembering, and people responded. Quietly, gratefully. Some even wrote back with their own strange stories. Nightmares, knocking, memories they hadn't thought of in years. The threads began to pull together, slowly, softly. She wasn't alone. One afternoon, as she walked through the local market, an older woman approached her, wrinkled hands, kind eyes. She didn't speak at first, only smiled, and gently placed a small cloth bundle in her hand. "For the fire," the woman said. She didn't ask who the woman was. She didn't need to. When she unwrapped the cloth at home, she found dried lavender, a small bundle of sage, and a strip of paper with the symbol again, drawn carefully, reverently, not mass-produced, not commercial, a gift. That night, she burned the herbs by the open window and felt something release inside her, something heavy she didn't know she'd been carrying. The past, perhaps, or maybe the need to keep explaining it. And then the knocking returned, not loud, not forceful, just a soft tap, 3 times, then silence. She stood in front of the door for a long time, breathing. She wasn't afraid. She didn't grab the dog. She didn't pick up the phone. She simply placed her hand on the doorknob and whispered, "I'm here." There was no answer. There didn't need to be. She opened the door slowly. The hallway was empty, but on the floor, another box, small, wrapped in the same brown paper. No string this time, no symbols, just a slip of paper, taped to the top. She picked it up with steady hands and unfolded it. Written in the same familiar handwriting were the words, "The knocking never ends, but now you know how to listen." She closed her eyes and smiled. She brought the box inside without hesitation. This time, there was no fear left to give. The fear had been a byproduct of misunderstanding, of looking outward for something that had always been rooted inside her. Now, as she placed the box on her small table near the window, she understood that this final gesture wasn't meant to alarm or disturb. It was a closing of the circle, a way of saying, you listened, you arrived, you remembered. She opened the box slowly. Inside was nothing extraordinary. At least, not in the traditional sense. There was a bundle of old photographs, curled and faded at the edges, a length of deep red string, and beneath it all, a folded letter sealed with wax. Not a symbol this time, but her own initial, the first letter of her name, carved into the wax by hand. She stared at it for a long moment, before breaking the seal and unfolding the letter. The handwriting inside was not her grandmother's, it was her own. Only, she had never written this. She read the letter aloud to herself, voice low, steady. You have walked through shadow and memory. You have stood at the threshold of fear and listened instead of running. You have answered without demanding, and in doing so you have restored the line. This is your inheritance, not in blood, but in knowing, not in magic, but in presence. What was taken through forgetting has now been returned through remembrance. You are not the last. You are the bridge. Let them cross. She lowered the letter, breath caught in her throat. How could she have written it? And yet, every word echoed something she knew deep in her bones. A truth so ancient, it didn't need memory to survive. It lived in the space between silence and breath, passed down not by language, but by rhythm, by footsteps, by the knocking. She lit the candle at the altar again, her fingers trembling just slightly. She placed the red string alongside the pendant and mirror. It felt like a key, though she didn't yet know what it would unlock. In the days that followed, the apartment grew quieter, not in silence, but in peace. The tension that once clung to the walls had vanished. Her dog no longer followed her room to room. He'd returned to his spot by the window, resting deeply, snoring even. She'd watch him sometimes, feeling grateful that he had sensed what she hadn't, that something had been reaching out to her long before she had been ready to see it. Animals always know. The knocking never returned in the way it had before. It wasn't nightly anymore. It wasn't insistent. Instead, it was occasional, a soft reminder, more like a heartbeat than a warning. She would hear it some evenings, as she wrote in her journal or washed dishes in the sink. Sometimes it came when she lit the candle. Once it came while she was humming the same low tune from her dreams. Tap, 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 always three, always calm, like a presence checking in, a thread still connecting her to something just beyond the veil. But now she didn't need answers. She didn't need proof. The story had changed, or maybe she had simply stepped far enough into it to finally see its shape. She started walking in the forest more frequently again, not because she was searching for something, but because she had come to understand it as sacred. The land remembered, the trees spoke, though not in words. They hummed, whispered, echoed. Sometimes, when she stood still enough, she could hear the rhythm of her own heartbeat reflected in the rustling of leaves or the distant call of a bird. She stopped bringing her phone with her. The forest wasn't a place for distractions. It was a place for presence. She carried a small satchel now, filled with her grandmother's journal, a flask of tea, and offerings, lavender, rosemary, stones she had collected. She didn't perform elaborate rituals. She didn't chant or call upon spirits. She simply sat, listened, remembered, and the forest welcomed her. Sometimes she thought of the small door beneath the tree, the one that had vanished. She didn't try to find it again. It had appeared only when she was ready. Its disappearance wasn't a loss, but a completion, a message delivered. She had opened it, she had listened, and now she had become the door herself. Strangers began reaching out, people who had read her writing or seen the small pieces of her story she shared online. They asked gentle questions. Have you ever felt something watching, but not unkind? What does it mean if I dream of someone I've never met? over and over. Is it possible to hear knocking, even when you live on the top floor? She answered, as best she could, not with certainty, but with compassion. You're not broken, she wrote once. You're remembering. That's where all healing begins. And one message she saved in a folder on her desktop. It read, I never told anyone about the knocking. I thought I was going crazy. But then I read your story. And now I think, maybe I'm not alone. Thank you. She sat with that message for a long time, hand over her heart. If nothing else ever came from her journey, that would have been enough. To help someone feel less alone, to tell them they weren't broken, to remind them of what was never truly lost. And then one evening, something unexpected happened. She was sitting on her couch, reading, when she felt it, not a knocking, not a presence, but a pull, gentle, warm, not toward the door, but toward the mirror on her altar. She stood slowly and approached. The mirror's surface shimmered slightly in the candlelight, not with magic, but with memory. She stared at her own reflection, searching for something she couldn't quite name. And then the reflection blinked, not her, something behind her. She spun around, breath caught, nothing. But when she turned back, a word had appeared in the condensation at the edge of the glass. Just one word, listen. She smiled softly, not afraid, not surprised, and she whispered back, I always will. That night, the candle on the altar burned low. The dog snored gently in his bed. The apartment was still, and somewhere in the distance, a soft knocking echoed, not on the door, not in the walls, but in her chest. A rhythm, a heartbeat, a remembering. The knocking had never been about fear. It had always been about return. The quiet that followed was not absence. It was fullness, a stillness filled with something alive. It hummed in the walls of her apartment, settled in her bones, and lingered in the space between each breath. Life carried on around her. Of course, the world outside still buzzed with deadlines, traffic, and noise. But within her own sphere, time had slowed. Or maybe it had deepened. Every action now felt deliberate, like lighting the candle, placing her hand on the journal, or simply making tea and standing by the window. She had stopped looking for signs and started recognizing presence. The knocking hadn't returned in weeks, yet she felt more connected to it than ever, because now she didn't need sound to know it was near. It was inside her, a constant, steady rhythm guiding her through the in-between. Her writing deepened. She no longer second-guessed every word. It wasn't that she had become more skilled, but more honest. There was no longer a division between what she lived and what she wrote. The same voice that had once whispered through dreams now lived on the page, clear, unafraid. She found herself remembering things she never consciously knew, songs in a language that made her throat ache with familiarity, places she'd never visited but could describe in perfect detail, faces that returned in dreams with the force of family. Memory, she realized, wasn't linear. It was circular, an echo passed down and waiting to be answered. She was not just a woman in an apartment with a dog and a story. She was a vessel for an inheritance too long forgotten. And now she had chosen to remember. One morning, as sunlight broke through the curtains, she woke with a new thought, not a voice, not a dream, but a quiet certainty. It was time to go back, not to the house in the forest. That place had served its purpose. But further, deeper, she needed to return to the place she had always avoided, the house she grew up in, the one she hadn't set foot in since the funeral, her grandmother's house, the place where the knocking first began, though she hadn't recognized it then. She'd buried the memory of that house behind walls of silence. But now she understood that the final key wasn't in dreams or boxes or mirrors. It was buried under old wallpaper and creaking floorboards and photographs still tucked inside drawers. She packed lightly, left the altar intact, kissed her dog on the head, and drove out before the sun had fully risen. The house sat quietly at the end of a winding road, just as it always had. It looked smaller now, worn down by years of neglect and weather. The garden was overgrown. The porch sagged in places, but it didn't scare her. If anything, it made her ache. This was where she had learned to listen, without understanding, where the air had always carried something unspoken. As she stepped onto the porch, the boards groaned beneath her weight, but the sound felt like a greeting. The front door stuck for a moment, before giving way. Inside, the air smelled of dust and cedar, and something else, familiar, old. She walked slowly through the house, not looking for anything in particular, but letting her steps be guided by feeling. Each room held echoes, laughter, arguments, stories told under blankets, warnings whispered through walls. She paused in front of the hall closet, the one that used to creak on its own in the middle of the night. As a child, she'd thought it haunted. Now she thought maybe it had just been trying to speak. She found her grandmother's room untouched. The bed was still made, the curtains drawn. On the nightstand sat a small ceramic dish filled with dried petals and a cracked photo frame. She picked it up gently. The photograph was of her grandmother, holding her as a baby, both of them smiling, eyes crinkled at the corners. Behind them, barely visible, was the old tree from the forest, her breath caught in her throat. The same tree. The door had been there long before she ever knew to look. Beneath the bed, she found a small wooden chest, not locked, not hidden, just waiting. She lifted the lid slowly, and inside were dozens of letters, bound by faded ribbon. Letters addressed to her, all of them in her grandmother's handwriting. Some dated before she was born, others from her childhood. One marked, "For when you remember." She read that one first. "You will think you're imagining it." The knocking, the dreams, the way shadows seem to move when no one else is looking. But you're not. It's always been you, little one. You are the echo that returns. You carry the voice, and when the time comes you will answer it. Not with fear, but with fire. I've left what you need in the places you feel most drawn to. Not all doors are physical. Some are breath, some are memory. Trust yourself. You are more than you've been told. More than even I could prepare you for. But I know this. When you stand in front of the mirror and no longer flinch, you will know it's begun. She finished the letter with tears sliding down her face, silent and sure. There was no more doubt, no more wondering. Everything she needed had been given. Hidden, maybe, but never withheld. The knocking had only ever been the truth trying to find its way back in. She stayed the night in her grandmother's house, not out of obligation, but out of reverence. She slept in the same room, lit the same candle, and placed the ring and pendant on the windowsill, just like before. The house didn't creak that night. The shadows didn't whisper, but just before sleep there was a gentle knock, not on the front door, not on the wall, on the mirror. She turned slowly and smiled, because this time she wasn't afraid to look. She didn't fall asleep right away. The knock on the mirror had stirred something, not fear, not even surprise, something deeper, a calling. She sat upright in bed, the dim glow from the candle flickering across the walls, casting gentle, swaying shadows that felt almost like movement. The house was silent again, but it wasn't empty. It hadn't been for a long time. Her grandmother's presence was woven into every creak of the wood, every dust-covered corner. But what stirred now wasn't only memory, it was invitation. She walked toward the mirror slowly, barefoot across the wooden floor. The glass had fogged slightly, the way it sometimes did without explanation. But this time, instead of writing appearing, she saw a shape, a faint outline, not behind her, but within the reflection itself. A figure standing in a forest. Her forest, the one with the tree. She reached out and touched the mirror with her fingertips. It wasn't cold. In fact, it felt strangely warm, like something living. For a moment, the reflection didn't mimic her movement. It held its own rhythm. Then, it faded. Only her face remained. But the message was clear. She had to return. She left at dawn. There was no fear in her chest as she walked back through the forest path. The sunlight came in long, gold streaks through the canopy, painting the trail ahead of her. She didn't rush. The forest had its own pace, and now she knew to move with it. The dog trotted ahead of her, tail high, occasionally glancing back, as if to say, "This is right. Keep going." The wind whispered again, soft and rhythmic, like an old song remembered. And when she finally stepped into the clearing, the one where the tree had once revealed the door, it was like walking into a memory still unfolding. The tree was waiting, ancient, rooted, whole. And this time, the door was already open. Not gaping, not threatening, just open. Like it had always known she'd return. She approached slowly, reverently, her hand brushing the edge of the bark as she stepped through. On the other side was no grand transformation, no burst of light or rush of wind, just silence, warmth, and the sense of stepping into a space that wasn't defined by time. The ground beneath her feet was soft, mossy. Trees arched overhead, in ways that defied physics, bending not out of necessity, but intention, like they were sheltering her, guiding her. She walked deeper, unsure where the path led, but trusting it regardless. The farther she went, the quieter it became, not an empty quiet, but a sacred one, the kind that asks for silence, not because it demands submission, but because it deserves reverence. Eventually, she came upon a small clearing, lit by a strange light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. In the center stood a stone table, smooth and unadorned, except for a single item resting on its surface, a bowl made of dark wood, filled with water, so still it looked like glass. She stepped toward it, drawn not by curiosity, but by recognition. She had seen this before, in dreams, in memories that hadn't belonged to her. She looked into the bowl, expecting perhaps her own reflection, but it wasn't there. Instead, she saw faces. One by one they emerged, some familiar, others not. A long line of women, standing in places she'd never been. Their eyes were different, their clothes from different eras, but every one of them looked into the bowl with the same expression, strength, sorrow, and knowing. Her grandmother was there, younger than she'd ever seen her. And then another woman, a face that resembled hers so closely, it took her breath away. Her mother, a version of her mother, at least one she'd never met, a life she'd never known. And then, her own face appeared, but not from this moment. It was her, older, wiser, whole. She watched the reflection hold her gaze, then slowly raise one hand and press it to the surface of the water. The gesture was not a warning or a command. It was a blessing. She dipped her own fingers into the bowl. The water was warm. When she withdrew her hand, a small spiral symbol remained on her palm, glowing faintly before fading into her skin. Not a mark of power, a mark of continuity. She was part of something larger, an echo, a cycle, a returning. She stepped back from the table and looked around the clearing. The trees swayed gently, though there was no breeze. She realized then that this wasn't a place to stay. It was a place to remember, a place to receive, but what had been given needed to be carried back. The altar had to be rebuilt, not just for herself, but for others. She turned back the way she had come, the path behind her now clearer, and as she stepped through the threshold of the door, emerging once again into the forest, the light shifted. Warmer, brighter, more awake. The dog barked once, softly, a greeting, a welcome back. And she whispered aloud, "I remember." She spent the following weeks creating a new space. Not just an altar, but a room of memory. One wall of her apartment slowly filled with photographs, some inherited, some recently taken. In the center, she hung a mirror, framed by dried herbs, red thread, and small stones. Below it sat a wooden bowl filled with water, just like in the forest. And beside that, a candle that she lit every evening. People began visiting, friends, strangers, people drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. They sat with her, not for answers, but for presence, and slowly they began to share their own stories, their dreams, their knocking. And she listened, not as someone with authority, but as someone who had once been lost in the same silence. Each time someone spoke, she added a symbol to the wall, a way of saying, "You were here, you were heard, you matter." And in this way, the room became more than hers. It became theirs. The knocking never returned the way it once had. Not loudly, not fearfully, but sometimes, late at night, as she sat by the candlelight, she would feel it, not on the door, not in the walls, but deep within her chest. 3 soft beats, like a heart remembering its rhythm, and she would close her eyes, place her hand over her heart and whisper, "I hear you, I'm still listening." Somewhere between midnight and dawn, she began to understand silence in a new way. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of everything unsaid, every grief that had never been named, every story interrupted, every goodbye that had hung in the air, unanswered. She started writing more frequently, but no longer for the sake of clarity. Now, it was for memory. Each word carried weight. She wrote as if her ancestors were reading over her shoulder, as if the knocking, once a mystery, had become a rhythm guiding her pen. And in many ways, it had. The room of memory had become a sanctuary, not just for herself, but for others who felt haunted by something they couldn't describe. People brought offerings, letters to the dead, drawings from childhood, pieces of jewelry they couldn't throw away, but didn't understand why they kept. She never asked them for details. They came when they were ready. They left when they needed to, and always, always, they returned lighter, not because their pain had vanished, but because it had been witnessed. One woman cried for 2 hours without saying a word. Another brought a stone from the steps of her childhood home and placed it under the mirror, whispering, "I just want her to know, I forgive her." A man left a cassette tape labeled Her Voice, 1992. The dog, once a restless guardian, had changed too. He no longer growled at corners or paced in the middle of the night. Instead, he slept calmly by the mirror, as if keeping watch had turned into something sacred. Sometimes he'd lift his head at invisible movements, give a soft huff, then return to rest, as if saying, "It's all right now. I know who's here." The apartment no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like a bridge, between past and present, between memory and story, between what was and what still could be. But with peace came something else: questions. One morning, as she cleaned the bowl of water beneath the mirror, she noticed a faint shimmer at the bottom. At first she thought it was the reflection of sunlight, but it didn't move with the light. It stayed, steady, almost pulsing. She dipped her fingers in and pulled it out. A tiny object, a key, old, rusted, heavy in her palm but warm. Not like metal, like something alive. She didn't remember placing it there. No one else had touched the bowl, and yet it had been waiting. She held it for hours, running her thumb over its ridges, wondering what it could open. And that night, she dreamed again, not of knocking, not of shadows, but of her grandmother, this time sitting in a circle of women, all around a fire. They were singing, low, rhythmic, ancient. The fire cracked, and her grandmother turned to her and spoke without moving her lips. "You have one more door to open." She woke with the key still in her hand. It hadn't been a dream, not fully, more like a message delivered between realms. The key felt heavier now, denser, like it had remembered its purpose. But there was no lock in her apartment, no drawer, no cabinet, no chest left unopened. For days she searched, not with desperation, but with intent. She went back to the forest, walked the old trails, returned to her grandmother's house, sat in every room, touched every drawer. Nothing responded, nothing shifted, until she returned to the hallway. The same hallway where, as a child, she had always felt watched, not in a frightening way, but in a way that felt expectant. The wallpaper was peeling slightly at the corners, and for the first time, she noticed a strange seam in the wall, too clean, too straight, almost invisible, unless the light hit it just right. She ran her fingers along the seam, pressed gently, and heard a soft click. A panel shifted, revealing a hidden compartment, and inside was another mirror. It wasn't like the one in her apartment. This mirror was old, dust-covered, cracked slightly in the corner. But when she wiped it clean, the reflection came through crystal clear. And for a moment, just one moment, she didn't see herself. She saw a room, one she'd never entered, bookshelves lined with candles, a woman at a table, writing. Then, just as quickly, it changed. Her own face returned, eyes wide, heart pounding. She lifted the key, and as if pulled by something unseen, she reached out and placed it against the frame of the mirror. The mirror shuddered, light bloomed around the edges, and then it opened. Not outward, not inward, but somewhere deeper. The sensation was like falling and rising at the same time. Not a rush, not a tunnel, but a folding of space. She blinked, and suddenly she was no longer in the hallway. She was in the room from the reflection, real, solid, lit by candles, smelling of cedar and smoke, and time. Books lined the walls, old tomes, journals, letters wrapped in ribbon. In the center, the table, and on it, an open book, with her name on the spine. She moved closer. Inside were pages already written, not in her handwriting, but in something older. Stories she didn't remember living, but recognized. A life once lost, a lineage long obscured. She turned each page slowly, tears gathering with every line. These were the women who came before her, their grief, their courage, their choices. She was their continuation, their prayer answered. At the end of the book, one final blank page, waiting for her. She sat down, picked up the pen resting beside it, and began to write. Not from fear, not from pain, but from memory, from truth, from love. Every word a return, every sentence a homecoming. And as she wrote, the room seemed to exhale around her. The mirror, still behind her, glowed softly, holding space, holding witness. Because some stories aren't just meant to be read, they are meant to be remembered and lived. She didn't leave the mirror room for a long time, not because she couldn't, but because she didn't need to. Time didn't follow the same rules here. It folded and unfolded like breath. Outside the world may have been shifting from night to day, but in that space there was only stillness and the heartbeat of remembrance. After she finished writing on the final page of the book, she didn't close it. She left it open, as if inviting the next soul to continue the story. There was no need for endings here, only openings. When she finally stood, her legs felt strong, grounded, as if the stories in the book had woven themselves into her bones. She touched the mirror frame again, gently, like one might say goodbye to an old friend. And without fanfare, the room began to dissolve. Not violently, not suddenly, like mist rising from morning grass. She felt herself lifted, her consciousness retreating from the warm gravity of the place, until the scent of cedar and candle wax faded, and the cool breath of the hallway greeted her once more. She was back. The hidden panel had closed behind her, the mirror gone. But her hands, her body, her spirit, different. She stood in the hallway for a long time, her fingers still tingling. The key was gone now, vanished with the passage, but she didn't mourn its absence. It had done its part. What remained within her was far more valuable, a knowing, not just of the past, but of her place in it. She was no longer just a woman, reacting to knocks in the night. She was the culmination of a line that had been knocking for generations, waiting for someone to listen, to open the door, to light the candle, and say, "I see you, I carry you, I remember." When she returned to the apartment, the dog didn't bark. He only looked up, stretched his long limbs and sighed, like he, too, had been waiting. She knelt beside him, burying her face in his fur, whispering, "It's done." And though she didn't say what it was, he understood. There was a peace in the apartment, now that hadn't existed before. Not just silence, but harmony. A sense that the walls no longer held trapped echoes, but living stories. She resumed her ritual that night, not out of fear, but devotion, lit the candle, refilled the water bowl, smoothed the cloth under the mirror, and then she sat in front of it, not waiting for a knock, but inviting presence. And presence came, not as figures in the glass, or names scrawled in fog, but as warmth, as certainty, as connection. She began to speak, not loudly, not dramatically, but simply, as one would, to a loved one across the table. "I know who you are now. I know who I am now. I won't forget." Days turned into weeks, and the apartment became a gathering place for stories. People arrived, not because of advertisements or social media, but because they felt something. Word spread in whispers of a room where something shifted, where silence could be held, where pain could be witnessed. She no longer needed to ask questions. People came ready to share. One man brought a box of photographs from his estranged mother. He didn't say a word, just placed them by the bowl, touched the mirror, and wept. A woman brought her child, no older than 10, who claimed to dream of a woman in a red shawl standing beside their bed, humming softly. When the woman described the melody, she felt her own breath catch. It was the song her grandmother used to hum while tending herbs in the kitchen. She sang it aloud, and the child smiled. "That's her," the child said. "She said you'd remember." Each visitor left something behind: a name, a song, a scent, a shadow. The wall grew fuller. The room became more alive. And through it all, she never once felt overwhelmed. She felt guided, because now she wasn't the only one listening. One evening, just as the last visitor had left, and the candle burned low, she sat alone in the quiet, and felt something shift. Not a sound, not a breeze, but a knowing. She turned toward the mirror. There were no figures this time, only her reflection. But behind her, in the glass, stood a glowing forest, just like the one she had stepped into weeks ago. The trees shimmered, the air hummed, and then faintly she saw them, the line of women, every face from the bowl, every life that had once been buried beneath time. They stood in a long arc, each holding a candle, and her grandmother stood at the center. This time, she smiled, not a sad smile, not a heavy one, a smile of completion, of peace, of pride. And as the reflection faded, she whispered just one word: live. That night, for the first time in years, she didn't dream of knocking. She dreamed of dancing, of running barefoot through fields of golden grass, of laughing, of singing with voices she hadn't known she'd missed. She woke with a smile on her face and tears drying on her cheeks. And outside, the city continued on, cars honking, people rushing, life moving. But within her walls, there was no urgency, only continuity, only a heartbeat that had once been lost, now steady and strong. There would still be grief. Yes, there would still be days when the air felt heavy, when old memories pressed against her ribs. But now she had a language for it. Now she had a way to honor it. Now she had become the altar herself. And as the mirror caught the morning light, she stood in front of it, pressed her hand against the glass, and spoke not to the past, but to the future, to every soul still searching, to every spirit still knocking, to every heart that wonders if it will ever be heard. "I'm here," she said. "I'm listening." And this time, the silence that followed was full of answers. Some stories don't end. They evolve in the weeks that followed. The quiet apartment became more than a place to rest. It became a place to awaken, not just for her, but for others. Strangers arrived with burdens too heavy for words and left lighter, even if nothing physical had changed. The mirror no longer shimmered with fear or mystery. It glowed with knowing, and she, once terrified of the knocks in the dark, now greeted them like old friends returning from a long journey. But peace never settles in one place forever. It moves like wind through trees. She began to feel a restlessness again, not the anxious kind, but the kind that precedes transformation. Something deeper was asking for attention, something that had remained quiet even through all the healing. She began to feel it when she sat too long, in silence. A pull, subtle but steady, like being watched not by a ghost, but by a truth she hadn't dared to name. It wasn't until she sat down to write one evening that it surfaced fully. She meant to journal like she usually did, stream of consciousness whatever came, but instead her hand paused over the paper, The candle flickered, and without thinking, she wrote a name. Her father's. She stared at the ink bleeding into the page. The name felt foreign and familiar all at once. She hadn't spoken it aloud in years, hadn't written it since the day he left. He had never knocked. He had never returned. There had been no mystery, no haunting, just absence. Plain and cold and unspoken. And somehow, that had hurt more than the shadows ever did. The days after she wrote his name were heavy. The peace she'd cultivated started shifting, not vanishing but bending, making room for something unprocessed. Grief is not linear, and healing doesn't come without cost. She felt herself pulled backward again, into memories she thought she'd buried. His voice once warm and steady, his laughter echoing off the kitchen walls, the way he used to tell her stories before bed. Then, nothing. The last conversation had been short, clipped. She was 14. He had promised to come back after the weekend. He never did. No funeral, no note, no explanation, just space, years of it. At first, she'd told herself he must have died. It was easier than believing he chose not to return. But as she grew older, that illusion wore thin. He was out there, alive, just gone. She'd buried him in silence, thinking that was safer, that if she didn't speak his name, she wouldn't feel the cut. But now the mirror had taught her, what remains unnamed will always find a way to knock. One evening, the dog began to growl again. Not sharply, just a low, uneasy rumble, deep in his chest. She followed his gaze. The mirror, it wasn't glowing, wasn't fogging, but it had changed. The reflection showed her room perfectly, except for one difference. In the chair behind her, someone was sitting. She spun around. No one. Turned back. Still there. The shape was blurred, as if the mirror hadn't decided what it was showing yet. She stood slowly, walking to it, placing her hand against the glass. The shape remained seated, still, waiting. She whispered, "Is it you?" But the temperature shifted, cooler, heavier, and then, ever so faintly, she heard it. A knock, soft, from inside the mirror. It happened again the next night, and the one after. Each time, the figure grew clearer, the shoulders squared, the face still shadowed, the outline unmistakably male. She began to sense something else, guilt, not malicious, not threatening, but heavy, like the mirror was holding a weight. He couldn't carry on his own. She sat in front of it for hours, speaking gently, asking nothing, just allowing. "I don't know why you left. I don't know if I want to know, but I'm here." The knocks continued, not loud, not insistent, just present, just real. And then, after the fourth night, something changed. The figure stood, moved toward the glass, closer than any spirit or echo had dared before. She could almost see his eyes now, and for the first time since he vanished, she didn't feel abandoned. She felt chosen. She began dreaming again, this time of places, not haunted, but incomplete. She'd walk through her childhood neighborhood, but the streets would twist into forests, then open into empty houses where all the furniture had been covered in sheets. In one dream, she found herself inside her father's old truck, the key still in the ignition, his scent lingering on the worn leather seats. A cassette tape played on loop, an old jazz song he used to hum when he cooked breakfast on Sundays. The dreams weren't frightening. They were fragments, memories trying to organize themselves. She woke up exhausted, but clear, as if something long submerged was rising to the surface at last. One morning, she found herself packing a small bag with no real plan, just a direction west. It was where he was last seen. where he said he'd visit, where the trail went cold. She didn't tell anyone, not because it was a secret, but because it was sacred. She drove for 2 days through long stretches of highway and quiet towns. She stopped only for gas, water, and the occasional stare from someone who seemed to recognize something in her. On the 3rd morning, she arrived at the coast, a small fishing village tucked between cliffs and sea foam. It wasn't on any map she remembered, but it looked exactly like the one from her dreams. She asked about him at a small cafe. An older woman behind the counter tilted her head. "You mean the man who used to carve birds? Quiet type." Her throat tightened. "Yes, he used to sit right there. Every morning, had a dog just like yours. Said he was waiting for someone." The woman looked at her long, then nodded slowly. "He said one day they'd find him. When they were ready, never left a number. Just that same chair." Every morning, she led her to a bench by the window, and there, carved into the wood, was a name, his, and next to it, a message. "I never stopped knocking." She traced the carving with her fingers, her breath hitching in her chest. The wood was smooth, in places where others had likely run their hands along the same line, as though the name itself had become sacred to more than just her. The bench was facing the ocean, and she imagined him there, quiet still, staring at the waves as they came and went, morning after morning, waiting, not for redemption, not for forgiveness, just for her. She sat down, and it was there, in the space where his body used to be, that the ache in her chest began to loosen. She didn't cry at first. She just sat, absorbing everything the silence had to say. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The waves spoke for him. The salt in the air carried stories she hadn't been told. He had waited. She had run. Time had passed between them like wind through branches, unseen but never absent. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I made it." And for the first time she believed he had heard her. The old woman from the cafe returned later with a cup of coffee and a folded letter. "He left this with me," she said softly. "Said to give it to the girl with his eyes." Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable, bold but careful. Her father's, "If you're reading this, then I'm gone," or close to it. "I never knew how to return, not after the silence stretched so long. I was afraid it would break you to see me, but I kept coming here, kept hoping the wind would carry me back to you. I failed in many ways. I know that, but not in love. Never in love. Every knock in your life that went unanswered, I felt it too. I am sorry. I am proud. I am yours." She pressed the letter to her heart. The wind blew gently through her hair, almost like a hand brushing it back. Her dog sat beside her, head tilted slightly, watching the horizon. And for the first time since childhood, she felt whole, not because the hurt had vanished, but because the truth had finally come home. That evening, she found a small guest house at the edge of the village. It was plain, wooden floors, thin curtains, the smell of old pine and sea air, but it felt sacred. She laid the letter on the nightstand and opened the window to let the ocean in. The dreams came quickly. This time she wasn't searching. She was walking alongside him, not the father who left, but the man she remembered before the absence. The one who lifted her to pick peaches from the high branches, who whistled when he was thinking, who held her hand a little too tightly when crossing the street. In the dream they didn't talk. They didn't need to. He just walked beside her through forests and fields, past homes she didn't recognize, until they reached a mirror standing in the middle of an open field. He turned to her, nodded once, and stepped into it. She woke up at dawn, heart calm. Back at the cafe the next morning, the woman handed her a wrapped box carved wood, sealed with a worn red ribbon. "He left this too," she said. "Ted not to open it until you stop dreaming of him." She carried it back to the bench, unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a small hand-carved bird, painted in fading colors, wings slightly lifted, like it was caught in mid-flight. And beneath it, folded neatly, was a note. "You carried the pain, now carry the freedom." She held the bird close, tears finally falling, not out of grief, but release. It was strange how something so small could hold so much weight. She closed the box gently, then stood and walked toward the shore. The dog followed, steps light, as if he too sensed that something old had ended and something new was beginning. She stayed for 3 more days, walked the cliffs, sat with the wind, spoke aloud to the sea, letting it carry her words wherever they needed to go. She wrote, too, pages and pages in a fresh journal, not just about him, but about herself, who she was before the knocks, who she had become through the silence, and what she would carry forward now that she had met the echoes with open arms. She no longer feared the mirror, no longer questioned the shadows. Every knock had been a summons to herself, and she had answered. When she returned home, the mirror room felt different, not in a mystical way, in a grounded way. The air didn't hum, the candle didn't flicker oddly, but it felt settled, as though the story had been waiting for her to come full circle. She sat in front of the mirror that night, lit the candle, and placed the carved bird beside it. "I forgave him," she whispered, "not because he deserved it, but because I did." The mirror didn't glow, didn't show a figure, but the glass rippled ever so slightly, as if sighing with relief. That night, the knock came one last time, just one, gentle, acknowledging. She didn't flinch, she didn't freeze. She smiled, stood up, walked to the mirror, and whispered, "Go in peace." And this time, nothing answered. Not because there was no one there, but because everyone finally was, present, complete. And in the stillness that followed, she finally understood. It was never about the knocking. It was about learning how to open the door. The knock had ended. The mirror had grown quiet, and so had she. But in that quietness bloomed something she hadn't anticipated. Clarity without the fear and noise. Without the shadows and the tension, there was now room to reflect, not just on the events, but on herself. For so long she had lived reactively, defending herself against echoes, wrestling with memory, interpreting signs and shadows like they were language. Now, with the final knock gone, she stood in a different space, not haunted, not hunted, just human. She didn't need to sleep with the lights on anymore. The hallway, once a corridor of anxiety, became a simple hallway. The creaks in the floor weren't signs. They were just wood remembering where feet had been. Even her dog, once bristled and alert, now slept deeply, sprawled on his side, trusting the silence. The apartment was no longer a place of waiting. It was simply home. But the question that lingered in the air like dust in sunlight was, who was she now without the fear? She found herself craving slowness. Her days became deliberate, not because she was avoiding anything, but because for the first time in years, there was no one, nothing chasing her from within. She'd rise before the sun, light a small candle in the mirror room, not for protection, but for warmth, then make tea and sit beside her dog on the floor. She began to notice things she had missed before. The way the morning light filtered through her kitchen curtains, the faint humming sound the refrigerator made that she used to confuse for whispers, the little sound her dog made when he was dreaming, like a puff of wind through leaves. In this new slowness, she also found emotion, not panic, not dread, grief, gentle, sweeping, quiet grief. It came in the shape of memories she no longer needed to push away. A childhood dance recital, where she scanned the crowd for a father who never arrived. A birthday morning spent watching the driveway, hoping his car would pull in. A teenage night where she stood in front of a mirror, wondering if her reflection looked like someone who was worth staying for. These memories didn't sting the way they used to. They didn't feel like knives. They felt like pages in a book she could finally turn without flinching. The story was hers again, and she didn't have to be afraid of how it had started. One morning, she received a letter, handwritten, no return address, no name, just a few short lines on plain paper. You carried what I could not, and you faced what I ran from. I never knocked to be let in. I knocked so you could find your own door, and you did. She read it 3 times, heart steady. This wasn't a haunting. It wasn't a trick. It was a goodbye, but also a benediction. Proof that even the most broken people leave trails behind, not to be followed, but to be understood. His knocking hadn't been about disturbing her. It had been about passing something on. A legacy of feeling, of confronting, of healing. With the mirror now quiet, she no longer spent hours in front of it. But she didn't avoid it either. Sometimes she'd pass by, glance into it, and nod. A quiet acknowledgement. She no longer expected figures or knocks or ripples. She didn't need signs anymore. Her life had moved inward. She had learned how to listen to herself, and that listening began to speak through her in new ways. She started writing again, truly writing, not just journaling for therapy, but stories, reflections, observations on grief, on estrangement, on how a person learns to feel safe again in their own skin. She submitted a short piece to a local magazine about how silence had taught her the language of forgiveness. They published it. Then came emails, letters, strangers reaching out with stories that mirrored hers in tone, if not in detail. People who had also lived with unanswered knocks. People who had waited in fear for the door to open and found, in the end, that what they feared most was already inside them. She wrote them back. Every one, and with every story shared, her world grew larger, not louder, just fuller. She began hosting quiet gatherings. At first it was just 2 or 3 people readers who lived nearby and wanted to connect in person. They met on Sunday evenings, sitting on the floor of her living room, drinking tea, wrapped in blankets, sharing moments they never thought they'd say aloud. I used to think I was going crazy, one woman whispered, the way the house creaked, the way shadows moved. But now I think maybe it was just grief, trying to get out. I didn't even know I missed my brother, said another, until I started seeing him in dreams. Not as a ghost, just as someone I didn't get to say goodbye to. The group didn't call themselves anything. There was no agenda, just space. And in that space, people softened. She watched it happen again and again. Tight shoulders relaxing, guarded voices opening, people learning how to listen to their own hearts again. It was sacred work, unplanned, unstructured, but deeply needed. And she knew that it had only come into being because of everything she had once wanted to escape. One evening, months after the final knock, she stood at the threshold of the mirror room, candle in hand. Not because she feared anything, but because she wanted to mark something, a cycle ending, a life beginning again. She stepped inside, and placed the candle on the floor. The carved bird still sat by the base of the mirror. She picked it up, held it in her hands, and looked into the glass. For a moment she imagined what she might have seen if this were the beginning of the story. A blur, a figure, a warning. But now all she saw was herself. Wiser, softer, stronger. She held the bird to her chest and said, "I am not haunted. I am whole." And this time the silence wasn't empty. It was full. The seasons turned quietly after that, each month folding into the next, like gentle waves meeting the shore. Spring brought wildflowers to the edges of the neighborhood, and she began planting small blooms in old ceramic pots on her balcony. She watered them every morning with a stillness she'd never known before, as if each flower was a part of her, unfolding at its own pace. There was something soothing in that rhythm. The fear was gone. The mirror was no longer a question mark, no longer a silent threat. Just glass, just memory, just history, now made soft. And as the sunlight came earlier each morning, and her dog sprawled across the wooden floor without a care, she began to understand something deeply. Peace doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes when we least expect it, on a quiet Tuesday, with tea cooling beside us, and nothing left to prove. That summer, she took a trip to a remote cabin by the lake. No signal, no internet, just her and a stack of books and her journal. The days were long, unhurried. She swam alone in the cold water, let her body float until she could no longer tell where she ended and the sky began. At night she sat on the porch with her dog curled at her feet, listening to owls, to wind, to the soft echo of crickets. Not once did she hear a knock, not even from the woods, and yet somehow she felt closer to everything she'd once feared. Not because it returned, but because she had grown large enough to face it, if it ever did. The knocking had changed her. It had asked something of her that silence never could. And by answering it, not with anger but with attention, she had stepped into herself. When she returned home, she found a letter from a woman in another state. The letter was shaky, written in blue ink with uneven pressure. It told the story of a daughter who had fled her childhood home, a girl who had once locked her door at night because something or someone used to knock and whisper her name. The woman had read her essay in the magazine and wanted to say, "I thought I was alone." She didn't ask for advice. She didn't want answers. She just wanted to be heard. And so she wrote back, simply, kindly, "You are not, I hear you." Over time, more letters came, and she answered each one with the same warmth, the same quiet strength, not as an expert, not as someone who had it all figured out, but as someone who had learned how to sit beside her fear and still breathe. By the end of that year, she had started compiling these letters, both the ones she received and the ones she sent. A collection of conversations between strangers who had all once stood on the other side of a door they were too afraid to open. She titled the manuscript, "The Knock That Taught Me to Listen." It wasn't meant to be a bestseller or a viral piece of media. It was simply an offering, a way to leave the light on for someone else. And when she finally held the first printed copy in her hands, her eyes welled up, not from pride, but from something quieter, closure, the kind of closure that doesn't slam doors, but leaves them open just enough for breeze and memory. One cold autumn evening, as the sky turned silver and the streetlights blinked on one by one, she returned to the mirror room. She hadn't lit a candle in weeks, hadn't sat there since midsummer, but tonight something called her, not in fear, but in love. She brought the carved bird with her, held it in her lap as she sat before the glass. Her reflection looked different now, softer, older, at peace. "Thank you," she whispered, not to the mirror, not to the bird, but to every version of herself that had survived. The girl who had curled up in bed, while knocks echoed through the night. The woman who had stood trembling at her front door, unsure what was real. The seeker who had followed a sound all the way to healing. "Thank you," she said again. And in that quiet, in that stillness, there was nothing else she needed. She stood up, placed the bird gently on the table beside the mirror, and turned off the light. The room was not dark. Not truly, it held a quiet glow, a peace that had once felt impossible. And as she walked out, her dog padded after her, tail wagging slowly, like even he knew something sacred had ended. Or perhaps something new had begun. There were no more knocks, not on the door, not from the mirror, not from her own chest. Only the steady rhythm of life, of healing, of love, rediscovered. And as she pulled her blanket over her shoulders that night and drifted to sleep, she carried with her the truth she had waited years to find. Sometimes the scariest sound in the world is not a knock, but your own heart asking to be heard. Fall settled into the neighborhood like a sigh, soft, golden, and slow. The trees outside her window shed their leaves with a grace she envied, unafraid to bare themselves before winter, and in their quiet surrender, she found a reflection of her own journey. For the first time in years, the changing of seasons didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a rhythm she was finally in tune with. There was no longer an undercurrent of fear in the cooler air, no lingering sense of dread that something was coming. Something had already come, and it had already left. What remained now was space for peace, for rediscovery, for life to begin again on her terms. She started keeping the front door open during the day, not wide open, just unlatched, a subtle act of defiance against the years she'd locked and double-locked it. The creak of its hinges no longer made her flinch. Instead, it reminded her she was safe now. Her dog had noticed too. He no longer stood guard by the door every night. He slept soundly beside her, stretched long, his legs twitching in dreams. It was these tiny details, normal things, that felt most miraculous now, not because they were extraordinary, but because she had once believed they'd never return. There was something radical about ordinary life, something sacred about its steadiness. But with calm came a strange emptiness too. Not fear, not sorrow, just absence. The absence of that high alert state she had lived in for years. It felt like walking out of a storm shelter and realizing the storm was never coming back. Gratitude mingled with a soft ache. She had changed. She couldn't go back to who she was before the knocking started. That version of herself, naive, untested, no longer fit. She had seen too much, felt too much, survived too much, and yet she wasn't broken. She was, in fact, more whole than ever. So when the call came, a quiet one, from a bookstore an hour outside the city, inviting her to speak about her journey, her first instinct wasn't fear. It was hesitation, yes, but not panic. "We read your piece in the magazine," the owner said gently. "It moved some of our regulars. If you ever want to come talk about it, no pressure, of course." A few months ago, she would have said no without blinking. She wasn't a public speaker. She wasn't even sure she liked being looked at for too long. But something in her had shifted, not in a loud or bold way, but like a door slowly unlocking. So she said yes. The bookstore was small, cozy, the kind with worn wooden shelves and mismatched chairs, the scent of paper and cinnamon hanging in the air. She arrived early, her dog staying with a neighbor she now trusted. Her hands trembled slightly as she stepped inside, clutching a copy of her little collection. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She reminded herself of that again and again. She was here to tell the truth. When the event began, there were only 12 people. She recognized none of them, and somehow that made it easier. They listened. She spoke. Not from notes, not from a script, just from memory, from the quiet place inside her that had once been filled with knocking. She told them about the fear, about the silence, about the mirror, about the night she found claw marks on the inside of the door. The room was still. No interruptions, no whispering, just breath and shared stillness. "I thought I was being haunted," she said, voice calm now, "but I was really being asked to stop hiding. I thought something was trying to hurt me, but maybe it was trying to help me see what I'd buried." Someone in the front row cried, silently. Someone else closed their eyes like they were remembering something too. After the event, people lingered, not to ask questions, but to thank her, quietly, gently. One man touched her elbow and said, "My brother died in 2016. I still hear his music playing sometimes when the house is empty. Your story made me feel less crazy." Another woman pressed a note into her hand without a word. When she read it later in the car, it simply said, "Your knocking wasn't your burden. It was your bridge." She sat there a long time before driving home, the bookstore lights fading in her rearview mirror. That night, when she returned, she didn't turn on every light like she used to. She didn't sweep the hallway with a flashlight or check the locks twice. She walked in, hung up her coat, and let herself be held by the quiet. It no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. In the days that followed, letters began to arrive again, not just from her own neighborhood now, but from other states, even other countries. Stories of strange knockings, of shadows in mirrors, of locked doors and open rooms, of people who had never said a word out loud, until now. She wrote back as much as she could, not with advice, but with companionship. She didn't offer cures, she offered presence. "I don't have answers," she wrote to a woman in Vermont, "but I do know this, silence can be a mirror too. What we hear in it is often the part of us most needing to be witnessed." And something in her softened even further. She began to think, maybe the knocking had never been a visitor. Maybe it had always been her, trying to return to herself. A few weeks later, she dreamed of the mirror again. But this time, it wasn't frightening. She stood before it, the glass still and clear, and instead of a shadow or a face behind her, she saw her younger self. She beguiled from years ago, the one who had once stood trembling in the dark, the one who had once curled beneath blankets, heart pounding as the knocking began. But in the dream, the girl wasn't afraid. She smiled, held out a hand, and whispered, "We're okay now." She woke with tears drying on her face, not of sadness, but of release. She began. That comes when a story finally makes sense, when a chapter finally closes, not with a slam, but a soft, steady click, a lock turning gently from the inside. The morning after the dream felt different, not like waking from something fictional, but like crossing a threshold. For the first time in years, the silence in the house wasn't just peace. It was invitation. The dog stretched beside her, his breath steady, content. He hadn't growled at the door in months, hadn't stiffened at corners of the room, or lingered near the closet. Whatever had haunted those walls, or haunted her, was gone, or perhaps more accurately, had been heard. A knocking doesn't demand a fight. It demands acknowledgement. She was learning that some doors don't open to let something in. They open to let something out. Later that week, she pulled down the box from the top shelf in the hallway closet, the one she had sealed after the worst of the fear had passed. Inside were old journals, clippings of articles she never finished reading, scraps of writing she once believed were too raw to share. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, not from dread, but from reverence. These were the footprints of the woman she had been. Some words were smudged by tears, others scratched down in a kind of desperate rhythm, sentences unfinished, ink pressed too hard. She didn't throw any of it away. She stacked them neatly and put them in a new box, one labeled Witnessed. That same evening, she received a voice message from someone at a community college who had read her piece in a small anthology. A professor teaching creative non-fiction wanted to know if she'd speak to her students. Just a guest session over video, nothing formal. She hesitated again, not because of fear, but because it still startled her. This idea that her story, what once felt like madness, could now be seen as meaningful. She said yes, not with nerves, but with a slow breath and a nod to her dog, who looked up like he already knew she would. "We're not hiding anymore, remember," she whispered, rubbing behind his ears. The day of the class came quickly. Her face appeared on their screen, framed by her soft-lit living room. She could see them in tiny squares, 20 students, some attentive, some tired, a few curious. She told them what had happened, not as a mystery, not as a horror story, but as a reckoning. The knocking didn't stop when I ignored it, she told them. It stopped when I acknowledged it, when I stopped trying to solve it and started trying to listen. The students were quiet. One raised a hand and asked, "Do you think it was a ghost?" She smiled. Maybe, or maybe it was grief, or trauma, or some broken part of me trying to come home. Another student asked, "Are you glad it happened?" She paused. That question held weight. Then softly, "Yes, because it taught me how to listen to myself and to others." Pain has a strange way of transforming into light, if we stop fighting it long enough to feel it. After class, the professor emailed her to say the students hadn't stopped talking about it all week, that several of them had written their own pieces that started with some version of "There was a sound I tried to ignore." Weeks passed, the days grew shorter, winter crept back. She didn't dread it this time. She bought extra candles, lined her windows with soft light, made a habit of baking at night, just to fill the house with warmth. The past didn't claw at her anymore. If it came up, it did so gently, like an old friend with softened edges. One afternoon, while walking her dog near the park, a woman approached. She looked familiar, but her name didn't come immediately. "I read your story," the woman said. "I live 2 blocks over. We've seen each other at the coffee shop." They exchanged names, and the woman hesitated before continuing. "There's something I want to ask you. It's strange, but have you ever wondered if you opened something? Not just in yourself, I mean, like when you listened to the knocking. Do you think you let something else out too?" The question lingered between them like fog. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked up at the bare trees and said, "Maybe, but I think it needed to be heard. Whatever it was, I think silence is where things get trapped, and acknowledgement is what sets them free." The woman nodded, like that made a strange kind of sense. Then, as they parted ways, she added, "If you ever hear it again, will you tell me?" "I will," she replied, "but I don't think it's coming back." And deep down, she believed it. That night, something did return. but not in the form of knocking or claw marks or whispers. It was a memory, not one that had been buried, but one that had never fully arrived. She remembered standing at her childhood bedroom door, age 13, hearing the hallway creak and thinking it was just the house settling. But now, all these years later, she remembered why she got up that night. Because she had heard something whisper her name, not from the hallway, but from the mirror, across the room. She had forgotten that detail until now. It came back like a film reel, unspooling. She had gotten up, walked across the room, and stood before the mirror for several minutes, frozen. In the reflection, she hadn't seen anything unusual, but she had felt something like being watched from inside her own eyes. She had gone back to bed and never told anyone, not a friend, not a parent, not even herself, until now. She sat at the kitchen table, the kettle boiling behind her, the dog curled at her feet. The mirror, it had always been there, a quiet observer, a vessel, but maybe it had never been the source. Maybe it had simply been the place where all unspoken things gathered. Her fear, her grief, her questions, her younger selves, and the knocking. Maybe it had been the sound of those selves asking to be seen. She stood up, walked into the mirror room, and sat before it. Not in fear, not even in curiosity, but in respect. She didn't light the candle this time. She just looked, and for the first time in her life, her reflection looked back without expectation. No waiting shadow, no flicker, just her, eyes steady, face soft, a woman who had finally come home to herself. Winter arrived fully that week. Not with a storm, but with a stillness that coated everything in quiet. Snow came in the early hours of the morning and blanketed the town in white, muting sounds, softening edges. The world felt paused, but inside her home things were moving, gently, quietly, but undeniably. She had begun sorting through her old belongings, not out of fear or paranoia, but out of intention. She no longer wanted to live surrounded by fragments of a self that had already been grieved. The knocking had once echoed in this house, like a demand. Now it lingered only as an echo, faint, distant, like a thunderstorm long past. She cleaned the mirror room first. She had stopped thinking of it as a haunted place. It was no longer the room where things went wrong. It was the room where she came back to life. The room where she listened. The mirror remained, but she didn't avoid it anymore. She passed by it easily, sometimes catching her reflection and nodding slightly, a subtle gesture of acknowledgement. The fear had dissolved. What remained was awareness, and in that awareness, she began to notice things she had ignored for years, like the small photograph tucked into the back of her bookshelf. A picture of her mother holding her as a baby. Her mother's eyes looked tired in that photo, not sad, just warm. She had never asked her mother about that day, and now she wished she had. Later that evening, she lit a candle, not for protection, not out of ritual, but as a gesture of remembrance. Her dog curled up beside her as she sat cross-legged on the floor of the living room, holding the photograph in her lap. She hadn't thought of her childhood much throughout this entire experience, but something about the snow, the quiet, the space she'd carved out through all this inner work, it brought it all back. Her earliest memories weren't of laughter. They were of doors, closed ones, locked ones, rooms she wasn't allowed into, questions she wasn't allowed to ask. And now, as an adult, she realized that the knocking might have started long before this house. It may have been echoing her whole life. The more she thought about it, the more it made sense. The knocking hadn't been the beginning. It had been the climax. The turning point. A convergence of everything she had avoided, everything that had been waiting to be acknowledged, every part of her that had felt abandoned, pushed aside, swallowed by silence. She'd always believed the supernatural element of her experience was the strangest part. But maybe the most haunting thing of all was how deeply she had buried herself beneath layers of control, denial, and fear. Maybe what had knocked wasn't an intruder. Maybe it was an invitation. And maybe the mirror had simply been the witness to it all. One morning, she received a letter from someone who had seen her speak online. The envelope was thick, handwritten, without a return address. Inside were 5 pages, carefully written, delicately folded. The writer spoke of their own experiences with unexplained sounds, things moving in the night, whispers just before sleep. But more than that, they spoke of silence, of how they'd grown up in a home where silence was the only language. No affection, no vulnerability, just routine, distance, and discipline. And when they moved out, they thought they'd left it behind, until one night they heard tapping on the wall between their bedroom and the hallway. It hadn't stopped. They'd ignored it for years, until they heard her story. I tried speaking to it, the writer confessed, and I started crying. Not from fear, but because I realized it had my voice, my silence, my sadness. She folded the letter slowly and placed it in a drawer with others, letters from strangers who now felt like neighbors. She no longer felt isolated. Her experience wasn't singular. The knocking was a language, strange, uncomfortable, but deeply human. It was the sound of the soul calling itself back. That evening, as she prepared dinner, her dog stirred from his usual spot near the kitchen window and stood still, not in alarm. In curiosity, he tilted his head toward the back of the house, the hallway leading to the mirror room. She turned off the stove and followed his gaze. The hallway was quiet, no knocks, no whispers, just the familiar hush of winter settling against the windows. But something was different. She walked toward the mirror room, slowly, not with fear, but with attentiveness. Her dog followed behind her. The door was open. She had left it that way. Inside, everything was exactly as she had left it, except the mirror was warm, not glowing, not hot, just faintly warm to the touch. She pressed her fingers to the glass. It was like touching skin. Her breath caught, not in terror, but in awe. And then, just for a moment, her reflection blinked out of sync. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even fully visible, but her eyes in the mirror closed a second before her real ones did. A delay so small she might have imagined it, except she knew she hadn't. She stepped back, her hand falling to her side. Her dog didn't bark, didn't growl. He just sat and waited. That night, she wrote in her journal for the first time in weeks. Not about fear, not about ghosts, but about her reflection. What it meant to be seen by herself, not the image, but the soul behind it. She wrote, maybe the mirror is more than a surface. Maybe it's a bridge, not between the living and the dead, but between who I was and who I'm becoming. She paused, then added, maybe the knocking was never about letting something in. Maybe it was about letting someone out. The words didn't shake her, they calmed her. She read them aloud softly, like a prayer. Her dog curled beside her, let out a content sigh. She closed the journal and blew out the candle, and when she passed the mirror on her way to bed, she smiled. She wasn't afraid, because whatever had lived behind that knocking had found peace, and so had she. If you enjoyed this story and the journey it took you on through mystery, fear, and healing, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. There's so much more where this came from. We dive deep into emotional, haunting, and thought-provoking tales that linger long after the screen goes dark. Whether it's eerie real-life mysteries, powerful emotional narratives, or stories that make you reflect on your own past, this is just the beginning. Join our growing community of night owls, storytellers, and deep thinkers. Subscribe now and never miss an episode. Your next unforgettable story is just one click away.